Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of History After Dark. Today we're joined by geophysicist Robert Schneiker, who will tell us about his recent research into the Great Sphinx. So, Bob, it's been a minute, but how have you been?
I've been good, thank you. It was a great summer and yeah, been an interesting year. Just got back from a conference down in San Antonio where I did a presentation on the Sphinx, and that's what we're going to talk about. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I can't. Well, I could probably complain some, but I'll refrain.
I want to say thank you for having me on. It's fun to talk about this with somebody who's interested in the subject. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. And it's always good to have people on who have, different methodological perspective on this because I come from a history background, so I don't know geology all that well, and issues like erosion are things where I kind of have to lean on someone else's work to get anywhere. So it's nice to hear from somebody who has a stronger background in that.
You know,
One
I
thing,
I totally agree. I don't see myself as much of a archaeologist or Egyptologist, and I mean, by Robert Schoch saying the age of the Sphinx is dependent upon erosion, that's kind of the way I get involved in this because it is now then a geological question more than it is an archaeological question. And that's kind of what I've been looking at. So I dabble a little bit in I have to into the archaeology, but that's not my strong suit. I'm a geologist.
I was looking into some of the popular literature on the Giza complex, especially on the Sphinx, and I didn't realize exactly how much of the literature Robert Schoch has gotten into. But almost every modern publication that mentions the Sphinx will have him come up at least briefly. So
Oh
that
yeah.
has had a huge influence on how this subject is treated.
Without question. So, I was just going to start how I got involved in all of this. I know we talked before, but I don't remember. And nonetheless, I think we should go through that. I was watching Nova on public television 13 years ago now. That's hard to believe. And there was an episode on the Sphinx.
Hmm.
And I was like, I don't really care about this episode, but I left it run in the background while I was doing something else. And at one point, I saw Mark Lehner explaining how shallow groundwater is wicking up at the Sphinx, and that the salt that's in the water crystallizes as the water evaporates, and those salt crystals build up pore space. It filled the pore spaces with crystals, and that builds pressure, and it causes the limestone, mostly of the sidewalls, to exfoliate and creating this rounded sort of weathering pattern, or I'm sorry, erosional pattern. And my day job is contaminant transport and fate modeling. I've got software that does that, and I do training in that. And it's a very difficult concept for people to understand that the water could actually wick up off the water table and evaporate at the surface. And then the contamination would go that same way. It would actually move from the groundwater upward through the soil and to the surface, where it might either concentrate or volatilize depending upon the contaminant. And that is just such a difficult process that to comprehend. Everyone thinks of a coffee maker where the rain falls on the ground, picks up some contamination, and then carries that down to groundwater. And here's the opposite thing happening. And so I was just going to use it as that. And that's when I found Robert Schoch. And I was like, oh my God, he's creating an entire civilization out of um, erosion. And I was like, that doesn't sound logical to me. And so I started looking into it, and I felt like I needed to, because nobody else was answering this question. And I got to say, at some point, I was also intrigued that I'm going to figure that out.
Right.
And so what I did then is I presented a paper on that. I did modeling in my software that shows that yes, at with the depth to groundwater at the Sphinx, and given the dry, hot climate in Egypt, the groundwater would wick up, and that's why the salt would form. And I gave a presentation on that at the Geological Society of America meeting in 20. I'm trying to remember the year on that. I think it was 2014, And it was interesting. And I chose that venue because, according to John Anthony West, the Geological Society of America meeting, the annual meeting, is the Super Bowl of geology, and that's where Schock presented his paper. And they're hanging everything on this presentation at the GSA conference. So that's why I chose that. And it was up in Vancouver that year. And it's kind of interesting. As I was putting up the poster presentation, I was poster number one, right under, because they're numbered into the hundreds. And it was right when you came in the door, and it said geoarchaeology. And another presenter from a few posters down came over and said, and was helping me. And I said, I don't belong here. I'm a geophysicist. And he said, I also don't belong here. I'm a geophysicist. And so we talked a little bit about my presentation about the wicking groundwater. Then we went down to his. And it was interesting because his was, he had been traveling in Tibet, and there were these Buddhist prayer walls. And when the monks found out that he was a geologist, they said, we have a mystery that we cannot understand, that the moss never grows on our prayer walls. And so he was intrigued by that, and he looked at the prayer walls and did some preliminary research and couldn't find any reason as to why there would be no moss growing on it. Came back, he was at the University of Utah, I don't remember his name, and wrote up a grant and got it and went back to Tibet to study why the moss isn't growing on the prayer wall. And he's looking at mineralogy, he's looking at sun, he's looking at angles, and he's looking at water flow, and he couldn't find anything. And finally, one day he was there and he was just staring at the outcrop, trying to, or the wall, I'm not sure exactly what it is, and trying to figure out what's happening. As he's doing that, this woman walks up and starts scrubbing the wall with water. So, so here it is. He answered the question, and unknown to the monks, the local women were taking turns scrubbing the prayer wall. So that solved the question. That actually turns out, I didn't put two and two together, but that actually speaks to what's happening at the Sphinx, because I've come to the conclusion that most of what people have been describing as erosion isn't erosion. It's part of the construction process.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning that some last time where, yeah, so it's, I guess, too, another factor that even for someone operating on historical time, obviously geological time is much more vast. So I guess it is sometimes difficult to remember that all of the monuments we see are built of materials that pre-existed those monuments, and of course go back millions of years potentially. And of course, that also can be misleading because the millions of years doesn't correspond with the actual date of the monument. So, how do you determine when you're looking at something that's constructed out of these old quarried materials, the difference between the age of the material itself and then the age of when it was completed?
Well, you really can't tell when it was created, and Schock is basically saying that. Any geologist would say that. He's simply saying that the evidence of erosion by precipitation, and I would argue any erosion whatsoever, would prove that the Sphinx is older, um, because there is no process by which, over the last 4,500 years, that the Sphinx could have been eroded. It didn't take me very long to come to that conclusion, but as a geologist looking at it with geology eyes, I couldn't figure out what that meant. It was very frustrating. So I get the fact that people would, like Schock, would look at it, and he very quickly came to his conclusion that it's some type of erosion. But when you look at the details, it doesn't fit any of the proposed hypothetical types of erosion, be it wind, be it water, be it the Nile floods, be it the wicking groundwater. Nothing, nothing fits. Nothing makes any sense when you're looking at the Sphinx. But nonetheless, as you first glance at it, or even study it like I did for some time, you kind of come to it looks like it's erosion. And it took me a long time, and I eventually, so anyways, getting back to your question, you can't really date the when the Sphinx was carved. It's just the fact that if it was exposed to erosion, well then, and there is no evidence of any erosion over the last 4,500 years, then just the presence of erosion itself indicates that the Sphinx must in fact be older, and that's the premise that they're using. And Shock is specifically looking at the water erosion, but there's other methods. But so looking at it, I finally realized that uh, w- I was trying to figure out exactly what was going on, and I went through everything over the last 4,500 years in terms of climate, in terms of history, and it actually turns out that any erosion that happened to the Sphinx is actually confined to a 1,100 year period from its construction to Tutmosis IV, because it was Tutmosis IV that, according to everyone, uh, put the blocks on the phase one, what they call repair blocks, onto the Sphinx body, and so the erosion is confined to that 1,100 year period. And Mark Lehner, when he was doing his dissertation, he looked at those phase one blocks and everything about them, the quarry from which they came, the way that they were cut, the way that they were put onto the Sphinx, everything about them says that they were the original blocks that were put there when the Sphinx was carved 4,500 years ago. And the only factor that stopped Mark Lehner from attributing those blocks to the original construction was the degree of erosion beneath those blocks that's on the surface of the Sphinx. And so and so what I was looking at was trying to figure out, well, what then actually happened here? And I could not find any geological process that made any sense. And I also, well, one of the other things I did, getting back to this, is I started at the very beginning. I started looking at, well, when were these rocks deposited? And it turns out that the rocks from which the Sphinx was carved were deposited about 40 million years ago. And that was during the Eocene. And I'm sure we talked about this last time. When saw that it was the Eocene, at first I was like, "Oh man, there's nothing any cool stuff has happened since the Eocene." I mean, the dinosaurs were wiped out, 66 million years ago, and you get the slow rise of the mammals. Not much else happening. Well, that is so wrong. The Eocene begins with a massive release of greenhouse gases to Earth's atmosphere, known as the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. The amount of carbon that was released is somewhere between all the known fossil fuel reserves on Earth and three times the known fossil fuels on Earth. Not just what we put into the atmosphere, but everything we know of. And this is just massive. And I started learning all about hyperthermals. And then I was like, okay, let me get back to the Sphinx. And I looked at the Sphinx, and at the head, the contact at the head in the body, and that had the characteristics of a hyperthermal. And I sat on that for a number of years. And so a little bit of a story here. I was tracking, Randall Carlson was on Ben's Uncharted X, and he's pointing out he's got his 20,000 papers, and he's willing to go toe to toe with anyone on the facts. And so I wrote to him and I wrote to Ben, and I didn't get a response. And eventually I tracked Randall Carlson down at his hotel in Mexican Hat, Utah. And we shook hands and agreed to a debate that he called for. I didn't call for the debate. He was the one saying he's willing to go toe to toe. I accepted his challenge, but he since has hidden. With good reason. I'm sure he doesn't want to try to defend what he's saying. And anyway, so the thing that I didn't know anything about, that discussed subject matter of the debate, and we settled in on the Sphinx, Göbekli Tepe, and the channeled scablands. And I said I didn't know much of the channeled scablands, so I contacted Bruce Bornstead, who's got a guidebook, and I asked if I could if he would take me on a private tour. And he said, sure, but why don't you go to the GSA conference? We've got a 4-day trip with Vic Baker, Richard Waite, Brian Atwater. I mean, these are the big name people in mega floods. And so I did that instead. And while I'm at the conference, one of the somebody walks up to me and says, "I think you're right." I didn't even recognize this person. I'm like, "Of course I am," but I was like, "What am I right about?" And he said, "I was right that there is an exposure of the middle Eocene climatic optimum at the head of the Sphinx." And that turns out that was Dr. Clay Kelly at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I had stopped in his office a few years earlier and suggested this to him because I was looking for some way to confirm my suspicion that it was there. And so when he did that, I presented a paper on that the following year at the GSA conference. And it turns out that this hyperthermal. So what happens? Everything that they're saying when you have a release of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, everything they said happens. The oceans become acidic. They become so acidic that organisms that are making their shells out of calcium carbonate go extinct. And we see that at the Sphinx. That there's a that the limestone of the body is a very fossiliferous limestone, but the head has no fossils in it whatsoever. And it's a very distinct change. And the limestone of the Sphinx body is very soft and weathered, but the limestone of the Sphinx head is much stronger, more resistant to erosion and to weathering. And so it turns out that that is the middle Eocene climatic optimum. So had this event 40 million years ago not have occurred, then the capstone that formed the Giza, it's a cuesta, it's not a plateau, would not be there. So the Sphinx and the pyramids wouldn't be there if not for this worldwide event. And the next year when I gave a presentation on that, one of the people there was giving another presentation, and that was Walter Alvarez. Do you know who Walter Alvarez is?
I don't actually.
You know, this really surprises me that nobody knows who he is. Do you ever hear of an asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs?
Oh, so he's the guy who discovered the Yucatan asteroid.
No, close. He was the guy who found the iridium layer.
Ah,
So he was working on paleomagnetism in Italy, and there was a roughly a half inch thick layer of rock, and he knew but that below that layer there were dinosaurs and other things that weren't wiped out at the KT boundary. And above it they're gone. And so the question he was wondering is how long does it take a half an inch of this rock to be deposited? And so he went to his father, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Luis Alvarez, and he said, you know, the Earth is constantly being bombarded by micrometeorites, and that contains iridium. And it's the only, basically, the source of iridium. And so the more iridium in this layer, the longer it would have taken to be deposited. And so they measured it, and the iridium came back off scale. That it would have been like millions of years. I don't know the exact number, but it was so long that there was no way that that could be the time period over which it took this half-inch layer to form. And that's when they realized, well, the source is still the same. It's extraterrestrial. And so that's when they identified the fact that it looked like some kind of impact had wiped out the dinosaurs. And then it was later that the that the uh, Yucatan impact crater was discovered.
ah.
So, so I was at the conference. Are you still there?
I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was at the conference and I'm talking to Walter Alvarez. He's talking about a mega flood and actually a mega lake Sud in Central Africa. And because of my research on the Sphinx, I knew a lot about that. And I actually gave him some papers on that. And he wrote a really great article about looking at that. And at one point, he's suggesting the possibility of a megaflood that would be like 18 times the largest of the megafloods that were in the channeled scablands. And so we talked about that, and then he said, "Well, what's your presentation?" And I came back and I said, "Well, I found the Middle Eocene climatic optimum." I said, "It's sort of like finding the iridium layer that killed off the dinosaurs, and I can't believe I'm telling you this." But so it's been the reason I tell that story in part is because I have met some of the most interesting people, and I've done things, and I think this is one of the things that we can agree upon, the people, no matter what side you're on in terms of the age of the Sphinx or lost civilizations or whatever, if it gets people out there looking, if it gets people talking, that's a good thing. And I've met other very interesting people, and I've been to places and done things I never would have done had it not been for this. Anyways, you have any questions on what I'm talking about?
Not so far. No, it's very interesting though how you've made this discovery and this correlation with the Middle Eocene climatic optimum and how that has impacted how that layer formed as opposed to the lower body levels, which are not as hard.
Yeah, when I first came up with that, I thought, okay, there's people who look at the Sphinx and they see lost civilizations. And I'm like, yeah, where's that? And I look at the Sphinx and I see hyperthermals. I'm like, okay, this is just, does it bring this kind of weird things out in people? Have I just done the same thing? Because here, I mean, the odds of the Middle Eocene climatic optimum, any hyperthermal, in fact, I think there's a possibility that there's a second one at the base of the Sphinx, the smaller one. But hyperthermals weren't discovered until 1991, so about the same time that Schock was and West were presenting their paper. And it was discovered by Ellen Thomas, and she was on board a ship, and they were coring, they were drilling off the Antarctic coast into deep ocean. And the thought was, at the time, reasonable thought is that you're not going to see any abrupt change because this is so deep down into the ocean that even if Earth's climate had a dramatic change, it would take some time and it'd be buffered by the time it would reach down to the bottom of the ocean. And
Right.
what you saw instead was an abrupt change, that the organisms that had been there suddenly go extinct in a whole new environment. She's one of those people that can look at a fossil and determine what it is, and from that, because they've already been dated elsewhere, you can date the rock. And so she very quickly knew that she was looking at something right there at the Paleocene Eocene boundary. And geologists had picked that out and said something big happened here, but they had no idea what it was. So I gave a presentation on this, and she was in the audience, and she called me on the fact that it can't be the Miko that's exposed on the Sphinx because it wasn't deep enough. Because there's this carbonate depth below which the carbonate, the limestone will dissolve. And what happens is during a time when there's a release of greenhouse gases to Earth's atmosphere, that depth shallows. But it should never, it would seem impossible for it to have shallowed to the point that you would see it in the rock that was being deposited to make the Sphinx. And I didn't get a chance to talk to her about it, but it was actually that contact looks exactly like the core that she saw when she was drilling off the Antarctic, where you have this limestone that's very fossiliferous, just like in the Sphinx body. And then you suddenly have limestone without any fossils, and it's a much harder, more erosion and weathering resistant limestone. So it was that contact that made me think of it. And I don't know why it's there, so I'm puzzled, but stratigraphically, it fits. It's there, and maybe this tells us something, and I don't know because I don't study hyperthermals, but maybe it says something about where how that hyperthermal occurred, and maybe it was something maybe local that was, I don't know. This is just wild speculation on my part.
So how much of the rest of that layer exists? Because I know due to tectonic forces, a lot of layers don't last. But I mean, I'm sure that there have to be plenty of other places in the world where this layer is still intact, right? With the underlying limestone, like you mentioned in Antarctica. but are there other places that are a little bit more accessible where you can still see the same stratigraphic layer?
Well, there's a couple of questions, a couple of answers. The first one is, I mean, at Giza itself, was your initial question kind of led me to think about, well, it as I take it, the limestone of the Sphinx head once covered almost all of Giza. And it was the reason that they chose to build the pyramids there because they quarried this high quality or higher quality limestone to construct the pyramids. And so there's so many people who are suggesting that the Sphinx was actually a yardang. Are you familiar with a yardang?
No.
So it's a feature that's carved by windblown sand, and you get weird shapes. Other names might be like a hoodoo and things like that. But it's just that it would undercut because the erosion when you have windblown sand, it really hugs the surface. And when you get higher up into to the air, the size of the particles diminishes. And even if it hits something, it's not going to do anything. It's more like just a dust. And so the sand grains that are going to do any erosion are close to the surface. And so it'll undermine and create things that kind of look like the Sphinx. And one of the big advocates for that is Farouk El-Baz. He is an Egyptian geologist with an interesting background. He was responsible for training the Apollo astronaut who stayed in orbit around the moon while the other two were on the surface. And that person was responsible for taking photographs and describing the geology that they were seeing in the craters and elsewhere on the moon. And he was also responsible for radar being taken on board the space shuttle and imaging the Sahara, which is when they first discovered that there were all these river channels under the sand. And that was as people were beginning to understand that the Sahara was green in the past and that there's no question that these channels are there. But he was responsible for finding that. But yeah, so he's saying that the Sphinx was actually carved from a existing shape that kind of looked like the Sphinx at that location. I totally disagree with that. To me, if it were, as I said, I think that that layer covered all of Giza. And there was an archaeologist, George Reisner, back in 1942, said exactly that, that the top of the head of the Sphinx marks the original surface at Giza, and I'm totally with him on that because what the limestone beneath the head is much softer, and that's pretty much what's exposed there today. And that is clearly not a natural surface. Anybody who looks at Giza today and thinks that uniform flat surface is natural is not a geologist because he's just going to go, no, somebody modified this. So, and it was the harder layer that was then quarried, and exactly what that looked like, I don't know, but it covered that. And if you look at the Great Pyramid, you'll see some of the limestone of the Sphinx head is actually incorporated into the Great Pyramid, and that's what was quarried there. And the layer above, if you look above, there's just have you been there?
I've not gotten to go there, no.
So if you ever get a chance, when you look to the south, so it's a layer cake geology. Let me describe this first. It's a layer cake, classic layer cake geology. If you've been to Utah, you've seen that there. But now instead of it being just basically horizontal, it was tilted upward, and that formed a natural ramp, and it was up that natural ramp that the blocks to construct the pyramids were dragged. Nobody lifted them. If anybody's suggesting that the blocks were lifted, well, you couldn't lift them today. Nobody would even in their right mind ever even suggest lifting blocks like that because the moment you try to do that, you're going to break them because they're not that strong. But if you drag them along on the ground, they're not going to break. And they actually lubricated the ground with a slurry that was most likely made from the mud that was left behind by the annual Nile floods. And so that was and that's how then that's pretty slick, and that's how they move these blocks around. Um, but if you look to the south, you're going to see that there's what's considered by some to be a wadi, and that's an indication that whatever rock was above the limestone of the Sphinx head was very soft, and it eroded away. And so you can determine how thick that was, and I bet that's what George Reisner did to come up with the how that the Sphinx head was the original surface at Giza. Now, if that is the case, and I'm going to argue that the geologic evidence for that is extremely strong, then you could never have a larger head. You could not have a lion's head. You could not have an anubis head. You can't have any other head than the Sphinx head that we see because that was the original surface. If you're carving a lion head, as Schock has suggested, well, a good portion of that, more than half or about half, is carved out of this soft limestone that eroded away to form the valley to the south. And so that's impossible. And it's one of those ways in which I look at Schock and I'm like, he's just not a very good geologist. I mean, he's so biased in what he's looking for. He's like, again, so many of these people, they find one piece of evidence and they're going to go with it, and they're just and ignore the evidence to the contrary. I look at the evidence to the contrary. That's why it took me so long to present evidence that there was an exposure of the Miko, or to get onto what I just presented at. So I've given 3 presentations at the GSA, and one was on the wicking groundwater, but that cannot. And people keep misquoting me. I've never said that the Sphinx was eroded, that the erosion that you're seeing today was all carved by wicking groundwater. That's not what I've said. I've said that that accounts for the erosion at the bottom. That's it. It cannot, I want to make this very clear, cannot account for the erosion of the body and cannot account for the erosion up at the neck. The erosion at the neck was caused by windblown sand. And it has all the characteristics of that. But that cannot account for the erosion of the body and is not associated with the at the lower sections of the wicking groundwater. So I was working on that, and I had convinced myself probably about 5 years ago that the Sphinx actually isn't eroded, that it was actually part of the construction process. And how I got there is I watched the Nova episode, kind of out of frustration, because I'm looking at the Sphinx and I'm going, it looks like erosion, but I can't figure out what type of erosion, and I can't figure out when that erosion could have happened. And so I watched the program again, and Mark Lehner was trying with a sculptor to carve a new nose, and they took the primitive tools. I mean, this is one of the other things that everyone thinks that they're using all these advanced tools. No, they carved this with primitive tools. A two-handed pounder. It's about the size of a large bowling ball, and basically that sort of shape. And they took that and out of a hard rock like granite or diorite, and they banged that onto the surface of the softer limestone and flaked the limestone off. The other thing they used was two-handed pounders, so it's a slightly smaller rock, maybe about a third that size. They cut grooves in it and tie sticks to it, and they use it as a hammer. And they use copper chisels just for detailed work. And when I saw that, I was like, well, that's it. That that's why it looks the way it does. I mean, the limestone of the Sphinx body, before they even carved it, the limestone was so soft you could crumble parts of it in your fingers. If there's anybody out there who thinks you can take limestone that soft and carve it into a statue, I'd like to see them prove that. I'd like to see a way of having actually done that. I think they had no choice but to pound those layers back and cover it with those blocks from the very beginning. So that's where Mark Lehner was wrong. He should have assigned those blocks to the very beginning because it's not erosion. It was part of the construction process. So I had convinced myself of that like 5 years ago. And I was like, yeah, it was only through the process of elimination and only by watching that program. But I'm like, this isn't going to convince anybody. I don't have the nail in the coffin to convince anybody that that's true. I've convinced myself, and I was still looking for alternatives all the time, like any good scientist, but I had convinced myself that was the most likely cause. And are you familiar with Dr. David Miano?
I'm not familiar with him.
He's got a YouTube channel and he does a really good job and he's very thorough. So I gave him a copy of my paper, and this is about 4 years ago now. And he looked at it, he sat on it for like 6 months, and he finally suggested that what we need to do is find some limestone of similar quality of the Sphinx body and do some experimental archaeology and carve it using these primitive tools. And if I'm right, well, then we will reproduce the pattern that looks like erosion on the Sphinx body. And I thought, well, no. I was like, no one's going to buy that. I mean, first off, I'd have to find some limestone where we could do that. And then people are just going to say, well, you just looked around, excuse me, until you found something and created the pattern that you want. And on top of that, when Mark Lehner on Nova, the original program I watched, when they tried to carve a new nose, they got a really high quality piece of limestone and they had to resort to modern tools to carve the nose. And I'm like, they failed at that. I'm like, no. I mean, I got his point, and it made me think. That's where I'm like, okay, I get it. I just remember thinking, I get it. We need to have some way of doing this. And I do my thinking when I go out on bike rides. So I was out on a 30-mile ride, and all of a sudden I remember, I was like, what we need is something that was carved by the ancient Egyptians at about the same time as the Sphinx through the exact same layers of rock from which the Sphinx was carved. I said, that's what we need. And I'm like, yeah, like that exists. And then I went, it does exist. It's the Osiris shaft.
Uh,
And I had just watched a video on it. And I was like, from NEXT. Do you know who that is?
I don't, but actually, now that I pulled up David Miano's picture, I have seen some of his videos before, but I'm not familiar with the other user you just named.
Yeah, so NEXT is John Anthony West was his mentor. And he, he believed that the Sphinx was older. And he was into all of that. And I don't remember how I started some email exchanges with him. But at one point I said, "You're too smart. You know too much." I watch him. I mean, he is so accurate on what he's saying. Nobody gets 100% things right. I mean, I'm sure I'm saying some things that are wrong. I try, and again, he definitely tries, and I think a lot of people are trying. But I said, "You're just too smart. You should have known this or something." I can't remember. Anyways, at some point he wrote me and said he no longer believes that. He no longer believes his mentor. He no longer believes that the Sphinx is older. And but this isn't the point. I mean, but he had also put together a video, and maybe because I knew of him, I watched his channel, and it was on the Osiris shaft. Well, everybody at the Osiris shaft goes straight to the bottom. And it's like 100 feet down, and down there you'll intersect the water table that's basically horizontal, that is beneath the Sphinx. And but at the upper layers, it goes through the exact same limestone as the Sphinx. And I was like, I just watched that video. And I was like, I can't remember what it looks like. And it was a bright sunny day, so I stopped biking and I looked on my phone and it was too bright. I couldn't see it. And I thought I need to go home. So I had to ride 15 miles back home. And I look it up and I go, there it is. Without question, the Osiris shaft looks as eroded, if not more eroded, than the Sphinx. But yet the chisel marks are still there on the protruding layers, and it's underground. It's protected.
Right.
And it was carved about the same time. I'm like, this is it. This is the piece of evidence that kills the idea that there's any erosion on the Sphinx. Because and then you can take the layers of the limestone from the Osiris shaft and superimpose them on the Sphinx. It's the same layers. They match. It's done. That's not erosion. They did the same thing, exact same thing at exactly the same time, using exactly this, almost exactly the same time, using the same tools, and they created a pattern that looks like erosion, but
Wow.
it's not erosion. It's
And
over. The idea that the Sphinx is older, the Osiris shaft, has killed that, and that's what I just gave a presentation on. And it was interesting because NEXT he was responsible because it's like an extra $3,000 to enter the shaft. I should point out that the shaft is located on the causeway that goes from the Valley Temple right next to the Sphinx up to the mortuary temple up to Khafra's pyramid, and it's about halfway up on that that the shaft descends directly below the causeway. I mean, so I walked over it and didn't look down. I'm not sure what you can see from the top, but I was like, damn it. But you have to pay like an extra $3,000 to access this. And there's another photographer because NEXT finally sent me those photos because he took them back in September and he was doing a tour in Egypt and then he went off to doing a tour at Göbekli Tepe and he barely had time to send those to me. So I actually printed them up as a side when I was down in San Antonio for the conference because I got them so late. But they prove it. And there's another photos. There's another photographer, Frank Schmidt, who is a German photographer, and he's really interested in how these things were constructed. So when he was in the Osiris shaft, he took a series of photos of the upper layer. Not as much as I would like, but he definitely until NEXT's photos, he had the best photos. So he's allowed me to use his photos. Again, if you go to my webpage, go to robertschneiker.com, you'll see a lot of this stuff is I just updated my webpage. Come to think of it, we could have done that earlier.
yeah, I've got your
Uh,
website up actually. What where would the pictures be? Under which tab?
so it'd be right on the main page, right on the main page. If you slide down, you'll see pictures of the Osiris shaft.
Ah.
And I'm like, we're done. That's not erosion. I'm not, I convinced myself, and now I was like, okay, now I have the ability to quickly convince other people. And again, I knew of that more than a year ago. And I didn't really present a paper on it because I'm like, playing devil's advocate in my mind. If I'm going to make a claim like Shock has that there's a lost civilization based on erosion, if I'm going to make the claim now that every archaeologist and every geologist who's ever studied the Sphinx is wrong because they were identifying erosion where there's no erosion, I'm coming in here and saying, no, everybody, not just the alternative archaeologists are wrong. Everyone is wrong. I better make sure I get that right. And that's why I sat on that for a while. And I've convinced myself and I'm out there putting it out there that yes, everyone is wrong. Mark Lehner's wrong. Robert Schock is wrong. John Anthony West is wrong. Graham Hancock is wrong. Everybody is wrong. And here's my evidence. That's not erosion. But again, I want to make sure I have that right. So are you seeing that on the web page?
Yes, and you're right. I mean, these layers do look very similar to each other. I saw another picture of the Osiris shaft earlier where you could still see the chisel marks on the wall. Um,
Yeah, there is one there. It should be on my homepage. Frank Schmidt took that, and yeah, I mean it's pretty distinct.
yes.
So that's it. Next question.
Huh.
I mean, and the Joe Rogan crowd. I watch, what they're doing. They surround themselves. He lives in an echo chamber. He'll put anybody on who's going to tell him the stuff he wants to hear. He won't put anybody on like me that's going to tell him things he doesn't want to hear. Yet he calls these other people not open minded enough, but these people live in this echo chamber. I've met Mark Lehner twice. I met him once in Boston and I explained some of this, and that was some time ago. and I met him in Cairo. And unfortunately, he just arrived on the and his flight was late, so we didn't get a chance to talk very much. And that was my last day there. I mean, I don't know where he stands on this, but I'm putting it out here. Those people talk to me. Does Hancock? Does Carlson? Does Rogan? Do any of these people? I've
Right.
tried
Well,
contacting all of them. Never hear from them.
yeah, I've heard
They're not open to discussions that prove them wrong. They're not scientists. NEXT is who is like convinced himself that it was. And I don't know. Maybe I had something to do with that. I don't know. But he convinced himself otherwise. What are you gonna say?
yeah, from what I've heard, I don't think you'll have any luck getting Randall to debate because I read somewhere else because I know you told me that he dodged you. I've heard he's ducked a lot of people over the years.
Well, this seems to be the norm. Milo and Casey, I forgot the name of their webpage. They've got a YouTube channel, and I appeared on that. And they used to be believers in the channel Scablands associated with the younger Dryas and the older Sphinx and all that stuff. And the moment that they realized it came to the conclusion that was not the case, they have been ghosted. Nobody will talk to them. The people that they knew, the people they made friends with. I mean, I don't know if you've ever gone on a field trip like that. It's a real bonding experience to go out and hang out with these people and see these amazing places. They 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 just won't talk to them anymore because they're not telling them what they want to hear.
Right. And I mean, this is something that they do need to answer for if they're going to try to give their explanation of, this erosion that dates back to, this pre-civilization that they posit. Because otherwise it'd be very hard to explain why this looks exactly like this interior layer.
Yeah.
Um, and elevationally, if we're comparing where the Sphinx is on the plane, how does that compare with the level that the pyramids are at? Because I know it is a little lower, but is it exactly parallel?
Well, so no, well, it's parallel in the bedding. So the area was originally horizontal. It's one of the basic principles in geology. Nicholas Steno, 1669, the principle of original horizontality. So those rocks were, the limestone was deposited horizontally, and it since has been tilted up. So it's dipping to about 6 degrees. I see different numbers. I've seen like 6 and elsewhere 10 degrees. It's dipping from the northwest to the southeast. And the low point is the Sphinx. And that's why right in front of the Sphinx there was a harbor, which is where they unloaded the granite blocks that they had quarried, like it's crazy, 500 miles to the south at Aswan, and floated down the river. So it's downstream. You don't need any motors, and you can load it onto these barges made out of reeds when they're on dry land, and then when the annual floods come, they get lifted, and then you just float them downriver and you bring them in towards the by the Sphinx. And when the water goes down, now they're sitting on dry land, and you can just pull them off. There's no magic here. This is anyway. So there's actually a harbor, and without question that there's a harbor right in front of the Sphinx, and so that's the access point where they would unload these things and haul them up. So I forgot why I went off on that tangent, but
Oh, we're just talking about the linking up of the layers you
oh,
see on
so
the
it's the
Sphinx with
same.
the
So it's the same layer. So if you were, so imagine you take a cake and you just lift one edge, and now it's tilted. If it
ah
were a plateau, like have you been to Utah?
I no, I don't. I have not.
Because I mean, what you see out there all over the place is plateaus, and the difference between a cuesta, which is what Giza is, and a plateau is flat-lying rocks with cliffs all the way around, where a cuesta is dipping to some direction, and it has cliffs on one side, but the other side it slopes down in a gentle hill, and that's what you have at Giza, and the Sphinx is not up on some plateau. I mean, the Sphinx is only 66 feet, 20 meters above sea level. The Sphinx is only as far above sea level as it is tall. So
Wow.
it's not there. And one of the things that I want to point out that I didn't, I was mentioning, comes to my mind. I was mentioning how the erosion doesn't make any sense in terms of when you look at it. It's like this can't be any geological process that's caused this erosion. So Schock is saying that it's water erosion, and his evidence of water erosion are the sidewalls of the enclosure. Well, those sidewalls, that roundedness, that was created by the wicking groundwater. There's no question of that. And the sidewalls have this rounded sort of erosion where the Sphinx body has more of an angular type of erosion. And nobody points out that those two are different, but they're very distinctly different. And those on the sidewalls were clearly carved, and you could see it with Mark Lehner if you go watch that episode of Nova from 2012. You can see where he goes, I hate to do this, and a section of he pulls a section off, kind of looks like a giant Pringles chip off the sidewall. But what's missing is the plunge pools. So these guys are all big into the channel scablands and how that's associated with the Younger Dryas, which I can prove it's not. And but when water goes over an edge, it cuts most where it hits at the bottom. Yet the floor of the Sphinx enclosure is intact. There is no erosion on the floor. This kills. The fact that there's no erosion on the Sphinx floor kills the water erosion hypothesis that it came from precipitation or water channeled and coming in, or even sheet flow or whatever coming into the Sphinx. This kills it because they would cut hardest at where it comes down. It does not do that. And then Schock went out and he did a geophysical survey. He did seismic tomography. Are you familiar with this?
No, I'm not familiar with what seismic tomography is.
So it's basically like a CAT scan where what you can do is with a CAT scan, you're using X-rays and you're looking at the difference in the intensity of the X-ray as you're measuring it. And you take an object, it could be your brain, and you image it from multiple locations. And then you can piece together what it looks like inside by having just passed this beam through at specific points. It's really a cool technique, and that's called tomography. And you can do the same thing with seismics, but what you're going to, instead of measuring the intensity, you're going to measure the arrival times. You're going to see how fast did the seismic's energy get moved from point A to point B. And again, it's principally a straight line. It's not going to be exactly a straight line when you're doing seismics, but it's principally a straight line. And Schock did this at the Sphinx, and he's saying that it proves that there is a hall of records, this low velocity zone beneath the Sphinx. But he did surface tomography. He was measuring the seismic velocity from points on one side of the Sphinx enclosure through the Sphinx to the other side of the Sphinx enclosure. He has no ability to measure anything at depth. That'd be like going in and having a CAT scan of your head and then telling you what's going on with your liver. It cannot work. And that is precisely what Schock is basically selling. When you read his article very carefully, you realize he backs down on that, and it says that the information for this the Hall of Records there is from some Japanese survey that was done with radar. I don't even remember, or something like that. I don't know, but he backs down on it. But when he presents it, he talks about it, and he's saying that his tomography data proves that there's a Hall of Records. That is impossible. That could not have happened. And in fact, if you look at his paper, I don't know if I put it on my webpage. Do you see that where did I put it on my webpage? Where you see that there's a black and white image of the Sphinx looking down?
Let's see. So there is
Let me
is
call
it the
that.
1896 image or
No, it's I don't know if I put it there. Let me go to my webpage. Almost there. I don't remember if I put it there or not.
would it be under the Lost Civilization tab?
No, I didn't put it there. I don't know. Is it formatted right? Sometimes this doesn't format right. I'm wondering if it's something wrong with the program. Anyways, um, so what he points out is that there is a seismic anomaly, that the velocity. He's correct. He identified without question. He identified that the seismic velocity under the Sphinx is lower than the seismic velocity in the exposed part of the Sphinx enclosure, the floor. This kills again his water erosion hypothesis. Because part of what he's saying is that since the Sphinx floor, he forgets he dismisses this whole thing. He never brings it up in terms of the plunge pools. But he's saying that the rock of the enclosure would then have been exposed to the environment for at least 12,000 years, maybe 30,000 years, maybe 800,000 years. He throws out all kinds of numbers like this and then backs down from them. But let's go with his most conservative number, 12,000 years. So he's saying that that limestone would have then weathered. So it's not eroding, it's just it's weakened by the precipitation falling on it, making it more easily eroded. Well, what he found using his seismic tomography shows that the lowest seismic velocities are not in the exposed floor of the Sphinx enclosure, but actually beneath the Sphinx. And the highest seismic velocities are actually exposed on the floor of the Sphinx. This counters his point. And to to make it so that it looks like it's doing that, he talks about the seismic velocity anomaly, the high anomaly to the north of the Sphinx, and makes no mention of the equally high seismic velocities to the south of the Sphinx. And I'm like, what the hell? he, 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 I'm not impressed with his ability to do seismics. And then I can see why he made a mistake regarding the Sphinx in terms of the erosion. That is very confusing and very difficult to do. But he looks at the tomb of Deben, which is also there at Giza, and he's calling that erosion by wind-blown sand. When I went to that, I nearly burst out laughing because that's impossible. And first off, it has all the characteristics of having been carved. They look like they took the softer layers and kind of made them look like beams and such. There's hieroglyphs that you can read, so that hasn't destroyed those hieroglyphs, which are much shallower than the supposed erosion by wind that he's pointing to. And and then on top of that, it was buried in sand. And so if sand were to actually hit that wall, it would hit the wall and drop. And then in no time at all, it would bury it. So and if the wind came from the other direction, well, then it just fill it without doing any erosion whatsoever. It wouldn't even hit it. I mean, it's laughable. What he's proposing doesn't even make any sense, and yet he uses that all the time as a classic example of wind-blown erosion. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's not even close. It can't be. Anyways, enough of my
S-
complaining.
So, out of curiosity, because we talked a lot about erosion, and that's the whole premise of their contention. So, in theory, to get the level of erosion that they claim is there, how long would it actually take for that to happen with the material of the Sphinx?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've never given that any thought. I would say that given that at the neck, especially, you could crumble it in your fingers. The layers below it varies in the hardness. For the harder layers, I mean, again, that's like trying to put a number on the erosion, and I don't think you can look at a surface and say how long it. I mean, Randall Carlson does that all the time. I mean, so he does it. Let me go down that tangent real quick while I'm thinking of your answer. He um he looks at the sidewalls, as does Robert Schoch, looks at the sidewalls of the Sphinx enclosure and says that that's evidence of erosion by precipitation. Yet this is very soft rock, and they all will tell you that the Egyptians were very methodical in what they did. They didn't do things halfway. That's why they're saying the disproportionate body to the head is proof that it once had a larger head. Things of that sort, because the Egyptians were so good at what they're doing. They never make any mention as to why they would leave the eroded sidewalls as evidence that there was erosion. I mean, it would have been the simplest thing in the world, the easiest thing to carve those vertical. It would have been the easiest thing in the world. It is because they didn't do it that they have evidence of their erosion. And I'm like, well, why would the Egyptians, and I agree, they were very methodical in what they were doing. Why did they leave that? Why didn't they just simply carve that and make it look nice? Why would they leave these ragged walls and clean up, recarve the Sphinx head supposedly, do all these other, carve it with, cover it with blocks, do all these things, not do anything, not even touch the sidewalls? It makes no sense. If I were going to do it, I'd be like, okay, let's carve these and let's make it look nice. They didn't. They left it ragged. That conceptually, it just doesn't make any sense that anybody would ever do that. Whoever did it, whenever they did it. And so the point being that those were probably covered with blocks, and the idea that the walls, according to Randall Carlson, were vertical, and he shows you examples of how it's then eroded to the shape that they have now, that they're more at an angle. Well, the angle at which they're at is roughly the same angle as that of the pyramids. Personally, I don't think that they were vertical, and there's no evidence to support that one way or the other. But it's crucial that they were vertical. Randall Carlson will show you those depictions over and over. You can find him doing that online. But I don't think they were. And I think that, again, they were covered with blocks from the start, but they were sloped down towards towards the Sphinx in the same way that they were sloped by the pyramids. That's what it looks like to me. The idea that those were vertical walls. So the thing is if you're looking at the erosion, you've got to make some assumption of what it looked like in the beginning. And the assumption that Randall Carlson is making, and I don't know what Schock thinks of this, but the one that Randall Carlson is making is clearly is a vertical wall. So then you're looking at quite a bit of erosion, and I don't know. So you got to make some assumption of what it originally looked like. Um, the idea that you could ever have taken the the, the body from the head down towards the lower paws, um, on the rear, and carve that into a pristine sculpture with that soft weathered limestone that's there is absurd to me. That could never have. Nobody could have done that. It's just too soft. Like I say, you could crumble it in your fingers. It doesn't make sense. And there's even a section that was missing, known as the major fissure. So there was a large gap that was discovered as they were working on the Sphinx, and that's why the head is smaller, because they decided to elongate the body to then carve the rear paws directly out of the limestone. And so, even though those rear paws today are covered with blocks, it's crazy, but they actually chiseled back. They gave them the Sphinx a manicure to put these modern repair blocks over the original construction. And it looks pretty crude. It is not this pristine sculpture. It isn't this high quality limestone that you have of the head. It's better than the body, but they carved it directly in. But it sure doesn't look like anything all that advanced. It's pretty crude, but nonetheless, they covered that, and so you got to make some assumptions. But I don't know. It's not my area. I don't think I'd even try to venture a guess how long it would take to erode that. But I'm just saying that it was never that in the first place.
Right. Okay, that's pretty interesting.
So, so what are your thoughts on this? I mean, everyone seems the media is full of all sorts of alternative explanations. What are your thoughts? I mean, I'm curious. What have you learned? That you think that you've heard that the Sphinx is, how it was made, how old it is? I mean, do
Um,
you have any thoughts on this, or is it something you haven't given a lot of thought?
I mean, it's always been my assumption that this was contemporaneous with the building of the three pyramids at Giza, and I guess the typical explanation is that it was built with the second pyramid, which I believe was Khufre. And
Exactly.
yeah, and that would make sense. Clearly, they're working in the area. They have the technology at the time. And then I guess a lot of the mystery, and I think really the reason why this has been discussed for so long is precisely because they chose not to write anything on the Sphinx.
It
Because
is interesting that there are no known inscriptions on the Sphinx. Um, yeah.
it'd be some real shit though if it turned out that there was writing on the Sphinx, but it was covered up by some of those blocks you're talking about that were added to help preserve part of it.
Yeah, I don't know what the likelihood of that is. I mean, an Egyptologist. I mean, did they mark everything? Did they? you know, I mean, the idea that the Sphinx is first mentioned on the Dream Stele 1100 years later, I take that as with a grain of salt. You know, I'm saying that. By the way, then, if I'm right, then Tutmos IV's repairs are far more or less significant than what everyone is thinking because I'm ascribing most of what is attributed to him to the original construction. And so it means the whole timeline of of the Sphinx repairs over the last 4,500 years needs to be reevaluated. And that, I mean, maybe some of what was attributed to Tutmosis IV, maybe it's still there. I mean, maybe it's just that they're going to attribute these other things to him. But it would seem to me the whole thing would like shift over. And that was what was ever done by the person after Tutmosis IV might be the things that he actually did because he didn't actually put those blocks there in the first place. So I don't know. The whole history of that could change.
Yeah, and I guess there's not a lot of ancient evidence about how the structure was regarded. I mean, I'm thinking back to Book Two of Herodotus, the first Greek historian. I actually don't know for sure if he mentions the Sphinx. I know he mentions the pyramids, but I'm I'm almost now I think back, I don't think he mentions the Sphinx. I'll look that up real fast and see.
Well, I
Um,
mean, it's just crazy that you wouldn't mention it because I can't imagine any time where if nothing else, the head would have been exposed, and I think people would have been like, "Oh my God, what is this thing?" Yeah. So yeah, I don't know.
okay, so
You would.
so the Google AI says he does not mention it, and the belief, I suppose, therefore, is that it must have been buried in sand at the time, which is the 5th century BCE.
Yeah, I don't know if the sand ever got over the head. From what I know, I don't think that's the case, and I would be
Right.
sort of surprised because when you're there and you walk down from the pyramid and you walk towards the Sphinx, you can clearly see the head sticking out quite substantially above the surface.
And also given its
If
importance and how it is this obvious man-made thing. I mean, you would think that they would clear out the sand if it compiled in that way. Um,
It sounds like that was a major issue to clean out the sand that it took forever and there were multiple times and it sounds like from what I can gather that the sand wasn't just there that it covered a large part of what's Giza now and in front of the Sphinx. What that looked like when it was fully covered in sand, I have no idea. But some of those pictures, I mean, they spent a long time wheeling it out of there because they didn't have any modern equipment when they were doing this, like 100 years ago. They did it with like a small railroad car where they'd load it up and then roll it down these tracks. I've seen some photos. I don't know to what extent that's exclusively what they did, but I mean, it was a lot of work. It took a long time to clear out all of the sand.
right.
I was going to say something else. One of the things I want to talk about, well, I was looking at my conclusions here. I want to make sure that we've covered everything. No, I mean we covered the last of it. Um, the one of the points that I want to make is John Anthony West made a big deal out of um, out of the Sphinx being older and being eroded by precipitation. And from that, I mean, I have a quote here. I just want to read this. So let me pull that up. and I because this is what I have in my slide. This is part of my poster presentation at GSA. I said so. Solving the Sphinx erosion enigma goes beyond its archaeological significance, as the erosion forms the foundation upon which alternative archaeology is built. In 1979, West wrote, if the single fact of the water erosion of the Sphinx could be confirmed, it would, in itself, overthrow all accepted chronologies of the history of civilization. And then I respond by saying, if he's right, then disproving the water erosion hypothesis would have similar ramifications on the fundamental assumptions of alternative archaeology. They've got nothing left. If this isn't erosion, they're going to have to come back and say that is water erosion. Because if it's not erosion, I mean, this is it. And so they've got to address. Of course, they won't. They'll just ghost me. They'll just ignore this. The comments that I'm making. They'll ignore my conclusion, even though this is at the Super Bowl of geology. And even though all the geologists are agreeing with me, I've yet to meet a single one that's agreed with shock. And I've talked to hundreds of geologists now on my research here. Not a one of them has ever agreed with shock. And he keeps saying that all the geologists agree with him. Who are they? But the fact is that the geologists agree with me and they're just going to dismiss this. And they can't because this is the evidence. They need to address it. When they're asking the scientists to address their points. And I have. And the other mainstream people have. Zaya Wass and Mark Lehner, they talk about their stuff. They are not doing that in return. They want special treatment. And the moment somebody starts calling them on them doing things wrong, well, then they just say, oh, I'm closed minded. It's they who are closed minded. It's they who are not willing to look at the evidence. That's they who are ghosting the people who are presenting evidence. And so much of what they say when they're on Rogan and such is just plain wrong. Robert Schoch talks about the Younger Dryas as being a humid, wet period. It's a cold, dry period. He can't even get that right. But that's integral to his whole hypothesis on it being solar flares. He can't even get the facts of the Younger Dryas right. And this is, again, it's important for what he's saying, but he's wrong about that. But rather than address it, they're just going to hide the fact that I'm doing this. They don't
So,
want to talk about it.
when it comes to the pseudo-archaeology crowd, is it safe to say that with the exception of Randall Carlson, that very few of them even pretend to understand geology?
Well, I don't think, I mean, so that's a good question. I mean, it's very different for everybody. I mean, Graham Hancock clearly doesn't claim to be a geologist, and that's why he uses, as he described him, an amateur geologist, and that's Randall Carlson. He described him as an amateur a geologist on ancient apocalypse. I'm not using a term that he didn't use. So yeah, he relies on people like that. He relies on people that are going to present that particular view. He also relies, and he gets people who are actually doing research, and they're using, they're seeing this as an opportunity to talk about their research. But he takes that and then distorts it, or some of these people actually believe what they're saying. So yeah, Graham Hancock, he defines himself as being a journalist. He's not, he's a researcher. There's a lot of people who call him a pseudo archaeologist, and I'm like, no, he's a pseudo journalist because the reason I use that term is because he does not, as I was just discussing, he does not present all the sides. He makes it sound like he's presenting the alternative information, but these are straw man arguments. And they're not based on anything. He's not going to mention what I'm talking about because, it's like there was a crater impact that was discovered in Iceland, and when they first, or Greenland, when they first discovered it, they were saying, we don't know how old it is. The geologists were saying it could be millions of years old, could be like 50 million years old, and it could be because it's under the ice and they had yet to examine it, could be just 12,000 years old. So when it was thought to be perhaps just 12,000 years old, well, then Graham Hancock mentions it. When it came back and they proved that it's not 12,000 years old, that's something like 50 million years old, he's not going to bring that up because he's only going to present evidence that supports what he's doing. And if there was something, or years ago, he a couple years back he had a tweet where he posted and he showed the statues at Göbekli Tepe with the hands coming together just above the belt buckle. And then he had a picture of one of the statues on Easter Island. It turns out there is only one. I did some searching. There's only one statue at Easter Island where the hands come together just above the belt buckle in a similar pattern to that at Göbekli Tepe. And he goes, coincidence, you decide. So I added a Santa Claus with his hands on his belly coming together just above his belt buckle. And I said, coincidence? You decide. Because, they're going to find evidence that supports that. But, the last thing he wants is you to be thinking that maybe Santa Claus is part of Göbekli Tepe and Easter Island. The evidence, that's not really evidence. And he's just presenting these things. So he presents an extremely biased view, and he uses people that allow him to do that. But then at some point, I mean, I don't know if he may have distanced himself from Randall Carlson. I mean, there's that program that Randall Carlson was on, Joe Rogan, apparently dealing with energy or something. I don't know the details. And so there's a program that hasn't aired. And I think even that, I mean, I don't know, but there's a part of me that wonders if it wasn't that he was saying things that Joe Rogan was just like, no, this is just nonsense, and he's not going to put it on. But I don't know. I
Well, I
don't know what
mean,
that is.
it looks like Graham Hancock, because I know he was doing this with America before, but he's very much getting into the spiritual aspect. Because I remember even in America before, there was actually a part in the book where he cites an ayahuasca dream for evidence. And so since then, that seems to be more or less what he's doing. So his latest book is called Visionary: The Mysterious Origins of Human Consciousness, and it's all about things that are supernatural. So he's kind of given up on the material evidence altogether, and he's focusing much more just on consciousness and things that are a little bit harder to disprove.
Is this? I think you said Carlson. You mean Hancock?
Oh, Hancock, sorry, not Carlson.
Yeah.
And actually,
Okay.
I
I
don't
was
know what
like,
Carlson's been up to the last few years.
I don't know either. Yeah, it's interesting that they go down that path. I mean, that's not my area. I can't. I mean, to come to knowledge like John Anthony West. I mean, not like Edgar Casey through dreamlike states. To me, that sort of dismisses the whole thing as being kind of ridiculous to start out with. I don't know if you know, but Mark Lehner actually went to Egypt to prove that there was a hall of records beneath the Sphinx. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that. That's kind of embarrassing for him.
Well, he calls it his cognitive dissonance. And so, but he acted like a scientist. So he went out there and he worked with a couple of other people, and they figured out where to drill. And nobody, again, Hancock and these people, they don't mention this because they don't want you to know that the Hall of Records was drilled by people funded by the Edgar Casey Foundation, because that Mark Lehner was. And when they drilled it, he said, and I asked him, he said within a, a few hours, a day at the most, he abandoned the idea. And like that's acting like a scientist. That's like, I have my hypothesis. I think this is what we're going to find. He was thrilled. He was going to release to the world the knowledge of Atlantis. He was going to reveal to all of us this knowledge. And yeah, he's not hesitant to discuss that. And yeah, there was another person with him, Matthew McCully, and I also asked Matthew McCully the same question, and he gave exactly the same answer, which was, a few hours a day at the most. They abandoned the idea and moved on. And Mark is Mark is now a PhD. He went on to study it, and Matthew McCully is this entrepreneur. So yeah, they looked at the evidence and they had their opinions, and they thought, well, I'm right, and if I'm right, well, then this should be here, and it's not. And so yeah, they change your mind. I mean, that's what you do. You follow the evidence. You don't
Right.
create new evidence to prove that you're right. You follow the evidence wherever it goes, and that's science. And you take it. And then if you want to hold on to some other idea, well, then find some way of responding to that. But that's not what they do. They just They just say, I'm closed-minded. I saw Dan Richards saying because I'm debunking because I started out saying I thought this was just crazy that the Sphinx is older, so I'm biased. I can't follow the truth. I don't have the ability. This is all implied or basically straight out said. But no, the answer is I'm a geologist, I'm a scientist, and if the Sphinx were older and if the Sphinx was created by a lost civilization, excuse me, then that would be fantastic. I'd be a millionaire. I would love for that to be true. It's not. If I could choose a reality, that's the reality I would choose because then I'd be very famous for having proven that. Instead, nobody cares, especially them, that I prove that it's not. I mean, they're all they're actually indicating their own biases and justifying their own biases and and scolding me and others for not being biased.
Right. Yeah,
Excuse me.
I've never understood the meaning of de-dunking. I feel like that has to be the dumbest channel name in the history of this platform.
Yeah, I didn't even notice that he had commented on my appearance on Flint Dibble. I just saw that as I was putting together my webpage. I was doing a search and I was like, oh, okay. But yeah, I mean, his arguments are pretty weak. And when I make my main argument, he doesn't even respond. He just stares at the camera and then goes
Right.
off on a tangent, even though I've just made my point. He does. I don't know. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but that's what he did.
Right. No, yeah, I've had a little bit of experience with de-dunking, and he tried to make a video actually in response to something I did, and it took me about 5 minutes to realize that it was a waste of time, so I never actually
Yeah.
finished watching it.
Yeah, well, I did watch that one. So Flint actually used some of my slides on the Joe Rogan podcast when he was in his debate,
Oh, cool.
and I don't know, and it was just interesting because they were just getting on to the subject of the Sphinx, and as they're doing that, Graham Hancock changes the topic, and then they never really investigated the Sphinx, which was I think intentional on his part. I don't know. I mean, conversations go all over the place, and I'm not sure that Flint is actually the best person because he's not a geologist. And like I said, this is a geological question, according to Shock, and I totally agree with him that this is not just a pure archaeological argument. It is more of a geological question on the erosion of the Sphinx. So, Flint wouldn't have been actually the ideal person. And, somebody like me needs to get on and explain this. And then I'm open to challenges. Let's talk about it. This is what I'm seeing. If you think it's wrong, well then correct me. Let's go through it. Let's go through the details. If you're really interested in this subject, then let's have that discussion. At least let me on to explain what I'm saying. And again, I'm disagreeing with everyone. So you can't argue that I'm mainstream science. You can't argue I'm mainstream archaeology. I disagree with them. You can't argue, you can't tell me I'm alternative because I disagree with them. I'm taking the evidence where it goes as I'm seeing it. And that's what a scientist should do. And
Right.
they're going to complain about that instead of answering my points. Anyways, enough of my complaining. I'm not typically like that.
No, I
Very
understand. I
positive.
mean, some of the people who get involved in, well, pretty much any academic field, I mean, there are definitely a group of people who are hyper pedantic and who get extremely defensive of their pet theories to the point where, if you're trying to introduce new evidence, they will take offense.
Yeah. So is
And
there something you want to talk about? I mean, we could move on to Göbekli Tepe or the channel Scablands.
let's talk about the channel Scablands, because I know you've brought that up a
Okay.
few times, and I remember that also got a lot of exposure thanks to the Graham Hancock Netflix series. There's a whole episode
Yeah.
about the Scablands and the idea of this grand flood that happened, I suppose, right at the end of the last ice age.
Well, see that so that's the way that they want you to present it, and you just gave their views. But in fact, there were multiple floods. There could have been as many as 100 floods, and there's some people who go and say as far as perhaps looking back over the last like 2.6 million years that there could be 1,000 floods. I don't know where all this is standing, but without question, there were multiple floods, and not a one of them was tied in to the Younger Dryas. So let's go down that path before I go down, because this is what they're hanging their hat on, and this is where they went wrong. As I pointed out earlier, Shock describes the Younger Dryas as a warm, wet period when it's a cold, dry period, and now with Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock in the Ancient Apocalypse, they're talking about that there is a single flood that's associated with a comet impact that's associated in some fashion with the Younger Dryas. Well, we can kill that pretty quick, because exactly what caused the Younger Dryas is still up for debate. It was originally proposed that it was caused by a glacial meltwater from the melting ice that it flowed on top at the northern Atlantic, and being lighter than the salt water beneath, turned off the basically the Gulf Stream, which caused the northern hemisphere to abruptly cool. And so it's been attributed to that. More recently, I just watched a video where a geologist is saying that the Younger Dryas was actually caused by a volcanic eruption, and that put these aerosols into the atmosphere and sulfur and such, and it reduced the sunlight reaching the Earth, and it caused a cooling period. And what they're suggesting is Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock. They're suggesting it was a comet impact. There's a couple of issues with that. Um, First, there's the Younger Dryas. There's also the Older Dryas, and in fact, there's other multiple events, abrupt cooling events like this. If you start looking over the last 2.6 million years, and if you're attributing one, the last one, to a comet impact, well, then what caused the others? Are they suggesting that every single one, like the Older Dryas, is also caused by a comet impact? They seem to be. There's some correlation. Not, I mean, it's still, the evidence is still being built, but there is some correlation that these cooling events are in fact associated with volcanic eruptions. And that makes more sense, because you're going to get periodically, you're going to get volcanic eruptions of varying sizes over the last 2.6 million years. To attribute one to an impact, well, then you haven't explained all these others. But it gets worse, because as I mentioned, that originally it was thought that the flooding in the Channel Scablands, what they're proposing, is caused by this comet impact, which abruptly melted the ice and sent the water down the Columbia River, and then it carved the channeled Scablands. Are you familiar with the Scablands at all?
Not very. I've never been to Washington State, much less that part of the state.
Well, so I only went because Randall Carlson agreed to debate me, and I thought I got to get up to speed on this, and I have. So what it is there was a glacial Lake Missoula. So there was a lobe of the glacier that came down out of Canada and into Idaho at the Panhandle, way at the north end of the Panhandle of Idaho, and it blocked the Clark Fork River. And when it did, a lake formed from the meltwater coming off the glaciers and from precipitation. Excuse me, and that created a lake with roughly the volume of half that of Lake Michigan. And but it's this ice dam, and it's pretty wide. It's like 20 miles across. And at some point, the water level in the lake rose high enough that it either floated the dam or in some way broke through this dam and then flowed down the Columbia River. And when it did, it reached a glacial lake, I believe it's called Columbia. And that was there because the Columbia River was blocked by another lobe of ice further to the west. And that created this lake. So all this water from this lake, the Lake Missoula, went into this other lake, and it overtopped that lake, and it sent the water across the land on higher ground where it stripped away this loess, this very fine grained material that comes off of glaciers, and then below that there's these the columnar jointed lava flows, and it just picked that off and created these kind of square shaped valleys, and um, and so and then what happened is the lobe of the glacier coming out of Canada advances again, block, blocks the Clark Fork River, and 30 to 50 years later, the lake is refilled and it bursts through the dam and it does it again. And so it did this multiple times. Each time going across, being diverted to higher ground because of the other lobe of glacier, really wide one, to the further to the west that was blocking the Columbia River. Um, so so Graham Hancock is all about the Clovis point, and he's just like all about that and how the scientists are wrong, and they admit they were wrong. But the reason they were proposing that is that there was an ice-free corridor that had opened up by about 13,000 years ago, and it had allowed humans to migrate from northern Canada, Alaska area down into the continental United States, going through this corridor. And without question, the ice had retreated to the point that it had done that by the time of the Younger Dryas. And that's the problem. Because if they're saying that it was a comet impact by this point, even if the comet had hit, and even if it had melted the water, it wouldn't have sent it down the Columbia River. And even if it did send it down the Columbia River, the other lobe that was further to the west isn't there. And so the water would have just gone down the Columbia River and it would not have been diverted to the higher ground. And so it would not have cut the channeled scablands. So you can kill that idea. And I was mentioning that I was on a channel with Milo and Casey, and they said that's a mic drop moment. And I was like, yeah, I mean, that kills that idea. It cannot have happened that way, not at that time. And on top of that, if you want direct evidence of that, there are lake varves. So this was just massive. So the release of water was something like 10 miles wide and 400 feet deep. And there's a point at Dry Falls where it cut these falls that dwarf Niagara Falls, but they're dry. There's no water there anymore, and that's only just a small section of what was actually happening. And just downstream from that, there are lake varves. So lake varves form every winter as the ice covers the lake, and then there's seasonal fluctuations. So they leaves come in the fall, and then you got the bloom of things in the summer, and then a winter, and you can kind of count these lake varves and these soft sediments like you count tree rings. And those lake varves at a point down gradient of the very close to Dry Falls, just a few miles downstream, without question, in the area where the flood would have occurred, are still there. And on top of that, there's a volcanic eruption. So now we can date it. And nobody's, as far as I know, nobody's actually dated it, but the last eruption occurred 13,600 years ago. So that means, and all the geologic evidence elsewhere points to the fact that all of the floods, and there were multiple floods, and the channeled scablands predate the Younger Dryas by at least 1,000 years, or about 1,000 years. That hypothesis has been killed. There is no way. So even if there was a comet impact, and even if it melted this ice, it would not have created the channel scablands. That's impossible. Their hypothesis, again, they're trying to make it fit the evidence. They just ignore anything that doesn't fit their evidence. That's impossible. That is just that deal's dead.
Right.
It's that quick. I mean, they spend a whole episode talking about it and talking about how closed-minded scientists are, and they're right. So it was J. Harlan Bretz. So there's a story here. So geology, and this is where I agree with some of the people when they're picking on Hancock and they're calling him a racist. I'm like, that he is the furthest thing from a racist, and they're doing that because they're saying that the views of alternative archaeology and alternative history is based on racist views. And There's no question that that's the case, but that doesn't describe Hancock, and I don't think anybody should go down that path and try to do that to him. That's just craziness. That's grasping at things in the same way that they're grasping at things and trying to make a point without making a really valid point.
Right.
Geology has its roots in the Bible. So, like Charles Darwin went out to prove the biblical interpretation of Earth history, and geology did try to do all of that. And so they were using a worldwide flood. And there were people who proposed all sorts of really outrageous ideas on how the geology that we see on Earth is based on is partially based on this worldwide flood. There's an area just to the west of where I am. It's called the driftless area, where the glacier is unaffected by glaciers. But the word driftless comes from like driftwood. It comes from an idea that was that at the time, that's why they called it that, is that it was not affected by the flood. And so, so geology has its roots in that. And so when J. Harlan Bretz, and then they're like, "Oops, our bad," and they realized that how ridiculous all of that was, and that the Bible is not a very reliable geologic source. And and so when J. Harlan Bretz was coming in and saying that there was this massive flood, without looking at the evidence, basically these geologists were saying, no, perhaps you don't realize we've moved on from that. We no longer are talking about worldwide floods. That doesn't exist in geology. And you're going back and they're like, this idea has to stop. And so they were trying to kill his idea because they were seeing him as trying to take geology back to the idea of a biblical interpretation, just because he's talking about these worldwide floods. And Hancock, presents himself as speaking for Bretts. And but if there's anybody who's going to do that, that would be Vic Baker. And Vic Baker and Richard Waite, they met Bretts and they talked to him. And I asked Vic Baker if he had any thoughts on what Bretts would make of people like Hancock, and he instantly responded he would be incensed. And so, Hancock is not speaking for scientists. He is right in saying that they were dismissing his idea without looking at the evidence. When they finally did, they were like, "How can I have been so wrong?" And they eventually gave Bretts the highest award that you can get in geology at the GSA conference. And Bretts was saying, he was like in his late 90s. And he's like, this is nice, but I can't gloat over this fact because everybody who was against me is dead.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they were pushing that idea that because and without looking at the evidence. So it was a point. I mean, there are times. I mean, scientists are people too. Um, but and they were definitely wrong. And I could go into that story a little bit further. Nick Zentner who's a geologist, did a wonderful series on all of that, and really goes into depth and finds out some nuances in this story that other people hadn't known. And and again, I've never heard Graham Hancock or Randall Carlson or anybody update their presentations to include the new information that was that was discovered by Nick Zentner with his research, and talking to the experts. And but that's the way they work. They have their answer, and once you have your answer, they stop looking. And scientists don't do that. I mean, I'm still looking at what reasons could have eroded the Sphinx, other
Right.
than what I'm saying. I'm looking for that. I'm open. Tell me. I'm very interested, and I'm looking all the time. So that's pretty much so the scablands. I mean, it's just amazing when with the flood, when it reached downstream, when it got to Portland, it flooded all the way down from Portland down to Eugene. I mean, this flood is just massive. But as I said earlier, Walter Alvarez is proposing that there was this massive lake, and if he's right, then the flood that went down the Nile, somewhere in the last 3 million years, probably closer to 3 million years. He doesn't give a date. Would have been 18 times bigger than the largest of the Channel Scablands floods. And so, it's not unique. And the English Channel was carved by, I believe, two mega floods. So prior to that, this mega flood during the Ice Age, at some point, I don't remember the dates. I think it was like 190,000 years ago, and another one like 300,000, but don't quote me. But yeah, when they looked at it, when they did radar sonar images of the surface of the bottom of the ocean, they saw all the characteristics of a mega flood. And you also see mega floods on Mars. And Vic Baker, I mean, if there's ever any program on mega floods, he's the guy. I mean, be it on Mars, be it on Earth. He's on Nova all the time on those kinds of programs. Yeah. So, anyways, so
Hmm, interesting.
and it's just a fascinating area to go there, and to see it and to just boggle your mind when you're at Dry Falls in particular. I think there's no better spot to just try to comprehend that it was something like 10 miles wide, and you're not looking at like a Niagara Falls. You're looking at 400 feet above you, and so this waterfall would have been like a little ripple well
Right.
below the surface of of this massive flood or floods. It's a neat place.
Oh wow. So okay. So this guy's been looking at images of Mars to look for evidence of megafloods there. That's fascinating.
Yeah, so when they first went there, when they started getting these higher resolution pictures of Mars, um, the characteristics, the geologic characteristics of a mega flood are there, but where did the water come from? I don't know where all this stands, but it was a real puzzle because it kind of looks like the water just sort of came out of the ground and then flowed off, but at the same time it was massive. I mean, unbelievably massive floods. I don't know I don't. I'm not familiar with Mars, but I believe it's even bigger than anything on Earth. And yeah, but like, where did the water come from? It just seems to have melted out of the ground somehow. It's weird.
Right, for sure. I mean, I guess there's been a lot of speculation that some of the water might have been reabsorbed and there are massive underground aquifers there, but I don't think it would account for all of the evidence that we've seen of the surface being shaped by water. So some of it might have just simply evaporated and been lost, but I don't know.
Well,
It's
I mean,
a
yeah,
fascinating subject, though.
it is. I mean, to look at another planet, and in some ways, it's very similar to Earth, especially back, about 4 billion years ago. Definitely had an atmosphere, and seems like it had water, and the evidence of life is building, but we have yet to have absolute proof. And again, so this is kind of the way that that Hancock and those people work. Um, is there life elsewhere? Almost certainly. I mean, the idea that life just happened on Earth is just really absurd. Basically, as soon as this planet was cool enough to support life, it supported life. And prior to that, it would have been too hot. It was molten rock, and so we can determine that. And so just learning that piece of information and is a clue. And then finding out that the evidence that there's, I mean, how many billions of planets now? There's a minimum of like two planets per star, or I don't know, that was some time ago, and now it's probably a lot more than that.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I
there's
think right
plenty of,
now the sort of prevailing model was that with the exception of the hypergiant stars, which tend to clear out the area around them. I mean, most stars the size of the sun and smaller, which is the vast majority, have multiple planets. So there's no telling how many planets. Plus, I've heard a recent estimate too that there might be more rogue planets than planets orbiting
yeah.
stars. So I mean, it's a ridiculous number of potential environments.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of those would be habitable, but yeah, I mean, the odds are that there are, without question, billions upon billions of planets that are going to be habitable. Not maybe in terms of complex life, but single cell organisms. That's what we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah, so when we find that someplace else, they're going to come back and say, "See," and I was like, "Well, no. I mean, any scientist, I think, is going to argue that yeah, it's probably there." but we've yet to actually see that evidence, and we can't draw an absolute conclusion. But that's the kind of thing that these alternative people are doing all the time, is they're drawing these grand conclusions out of partial information. And I mean, personally, you hear everyone talking about, the cultural shock and disorientation, to quote 2001, which is a lot of things what they seem to be doing, with finding life elsewhere. I think the response is going to be very different. I think they're going to say, well, we knew that all along. You're finally telling us what we already knew, but we don't
Right.
know it. And that's the point. We do not know it until we absolutely have proven that it's there. We're not going to say that. And that's the way science works. And
Right.
they want science to go with these weird hypotheses, and and the likelihood that life is out there, I would argue, is, yeah, it's extremely high. But we've yet to find absolute proof that it is.
Right.
And
We,
and and that's the difference. And
yeah,
that's what they're hanging their hats on.
because at this point, I mean, people talk about you can look at the atmospheres of exoplanets for biomarkers, but then, their scientists have pointed out that those same chemicals can be produced by natural processes that don't involve life. So, I mean, the whole system is still we're in a very, very early stages of doing that. I mean, I guess I would compare it to the early stages of exploration. The age of exploration begins with what the Portuguese and with the 1450s, and I don't think the whole Pacific was mapped until nearly 1800.
Yeah. Hey, I want to get back to something that I just watched an episode where Joe Rogan was talking, and he was talking about farming. And I found myself agreeing with him. You know, and again, I'm not an archaeologist, but it's something I've independently have come to, that I think farming, to some extent, humans were familiar with farming, thousands of years earlier than they actually used it. There's seeds that only germinate after having gone through a digestive system, and it could be their own, it could be others, and I think they'd see that, and I think that and they may have done things like, planted a tree, knowing at some point in the future when they're going to come there, that tree may have grown in, and I think, but that would not bear the marks of domestication. And it wasn't until they settled down at some place like Göbekli Tepe, and they did that without farming. That's clear. There's no farming, there's no domesticated plants or animals. This is clearly the pre-pottery Neolithic. And it was only when they sort of trapped themselves by settling down, because the resources locally were so abundant, that they then had to find a way, and their population had grown, so they had to find a way to make it work, and that's when they kind of resorted to farming. But I think the roots of farming would predate that, and probably predate the um, the arrival of Americas into the people into the Americas. I think that and that would help to explain why it occurred in many places. Now, again, this is me speculating as a geologist in an area, and it may be that there's archaeologists that say, "Oh no, what you're forgetting is this," or we already know, there's this other evidence that counters that sort of thing. But I found myself tentatively agreeing with that. Well, one of the things that I want to get into, I don't know if you want to keep going.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so one of the things that really bugs me about what they're saying, and this is one of their main points, and it's so obvious that it's wrong, and that is that they'll mention that the human species is Homo sapiens. There's a skull in Morocco that's like 300,000 years old. In fact, it's dated a little bit older than that. And so their argument is that, well, if modern humans have been here for 300,000 years, why did it take until the last interglacial for them to create civilization? Why didn't they do that 300,000 years ago? The thing is that if you saw that skull that they collected in Morocco, the one that they're using, that they and then they're classifying as modern humans, If you saw it, you'd be like, "Who's the idiot who decided that's a modern human?" Because it's got these heavy brow ridges. It doesn't look anything. I think if you ran into that person on the street, you'd be like, "Oh my God, who is this?"
Right.
It, so you've got to draw the line somewhere. But to imagine that this line is an abrupt change from an earlier version to us as we are exactly now is ridiculous. Yet, that is one of their core arguments that they're making over and over and over again. I mean,
Right.
it still doesn't completely answer the question as to why was it only in the last interglacial and that that now that civilization began. It still doesn't address that directly, but it does narrow it down so it couldn't have happened 300,000 years ago because they weren't like us. And there's Brian Hume. Are you familiar with him?
I'm
And
not
Richard
familiar.
Wrangham.
No, I haven't heard of them.
So Richard Wrangham worked with Jane Goodall, and he's written some interesting books. And he's just this guy with these big ideas. Cooking Made Us Human is one of his books. Demonic Males is another. And he's really big into this whole thing of self-domestication. And so if you look at an organism that's been domesticated, their brains get smaller, their faces less protruding, they have more like juvenile features. And humans, if you look at our species through time, we have all the hallmarks of a domesticated species, but we domesticated ourselves. And and Brian Hume is worked with him, and he's got I think it's called the evolution of the friendliest. I mean, in some ways that describes human, in others we're not friendly at all. But Brian Hume is of the opinion that the sclera, the whites of our eyes, didn't evolve until 70,000 years ago. Because if you look at other primates, they don't have whites of their eyes. And and it's only humans. And occasionally, here and there, a chimpanzee will have whites in their eyes. But and it's thought to have developed as part of the ability for us to hunt together. So yeah, I could if I could see you, I'd be seeing where you're looking right now, and then I'd be looking in that direction to see what it is you're looking at. And dogs will work with humans on this, but if you take a chimpanzee and you hide something and you point to it, they won't get it. They they won't. You're pointing to the location where it is that they want to find this reward. It doesn't help them at all. They
Right.
just can't do it.
Right. The
And
need
when I
for
first
complex communication is hugely important for developing civilization.
Yeah, so the whole idea that just because they're anatomically modern human 300,000 years ago, which again is like, well, maybe, I mean, I guess we'll draw that line there, but just there's other aspects of us and our behavior that haven't evolved until much more recently. And so they're dismissing all of that. They're dismissing all of this research into when we started doing art, when we started, maybe doing other things, they'll grasp onto things like when there was evidence of what is it, like 300,000 years ago, something where it looks like somebody stacked up some logs, kind of like Lincoln logs, if you played with those when you were a kid, where they
Right.
cut
Yeah.
notches in one to put on top the other, and they're seeing that as a potential structure. I mean, yeah. So, but did it take root? Just because you found that doesn't mean it was a structure. It could have been just a walkway, a little bridge, a stepping stone, and they put the logs down and they rolled, and they're like, how do you stop the log from rolling? You cut these notches in it, and
Yeah.
so there could be alternative explanations, and to jump instantly and say, well, see this log, well then this proves that there was an advanced civilization. I'm like,
Well, I mean, that's
no.
kind of a joke with early archaeology. That one of my friends had a shirt where it says one rock, two rocks. If you have three rocks, then you have a sophisticated fortification zone.
Yeah. So
Uh,
yeah, I mean, so there, I mean, there's really interesting, and this is the, it was, I do want to say, as I said earlier, that I have been places and have met people and done things I never would have done, and I think I can agree with Hancock and Carlson and Schock. that they're saying that, that's part of what they hope happens. Um, where was I going to go with that? But but you got to be open minded to what you're seeing, and 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 no, I wasn't going to go there. I was going to, but I mean, it does take me back. I mean, that's why I went off on a tangent here. I mean, I've been to Egypt. I never would have gone to Egypt. I met Walter Alvarez. I met Vic Baker and Brian Atwater and Richard Waite, and these are names that I would read in textbooks, but the odds of my meeting them it would be like nothing, and I learned so much about the history of our planet over the last like 56 million years, and there's just amazing things that have happened. And if they hadn't happened, we may not be here. And I mean, I could go off on all sorts of tangents right now. And I did all of that because I was questioning whether or not the Sphinx was eroded. So there is some good that can come out of this.
Right. I
And
remember
I think that, go ahead.
at one time my uncle, who was in the sciences, told me that no matter how stupid a question might be, it could always yield an interesting answer.
Exactly. I mean, there are questions you go, well, I don't know. But yeah, and especially when you try to understand why that person raised it. So, I can see why Graham Hancock would and Randall Carlson, given who they are and what they know, why they would think the way that they're thinking. Um, I wish they could act more like Mark Lehner, and NEXT, and that to follow the evidence like a scientist where it really goes, instead of rehashing the same things that they're talking about. I mean, I'm presenting something entirely new,
Right.
that it's not erosion. They're just sort of rehashing, Eric von Donigan kind of stuff, and Atlantis and things. I mean, like Schock says all the geologists agree with him, but at the same time, he has what he calls the A word, Atlantis, and he can't use that around geologists because we're not ready. And to me, that means no, it's not that we're not ready. It means he cannot defend it. He's convinced himself on this, but he can't defend it. And that's why the problem isn't that he's got an idea he can't defend. The problem is the geologists like myself who aren't open minded to an idea that he can't defend. And so, so the thing is that when I'm making my point here, I was looking for evidence, like I said, to find that there's no erosion, and I found that in the Osiris shaft, and I waited until then. These people are just like jumping on things and then giving quick answers, and then moving on to the next thing, and they're confusing a lot of people on this stuff.
Yeah. Speaking of Atlantis and sort of these theories that get spread in this way, I was wondering, as a geologist who's studied the Sahara some, what could you tell me about the Eye of the Sahara? Because I've seen that put forward as a potential location for Atlantis.
I don't know much about it. It sure looks like it's an impact site to me, and I don't see. And again, I've never really read anything on it. Um, it doesn't seem to fit the story of Atlantis that it's underwater, but they recreate this and they're talking, just because it's circular is basically the evidence, I think. I know there's a YouTube channel, I don't know if you're familiar with Itchy Boots. And it's this woman who happens to be a geologist, but she doesn't do much with geology. And she rides all over the world. And she went there and she's like there. And there's this guy who's trying to sell these, sophisticated tools and artifacts associated with the site. And everything's extremely primitive. There's nothing there that looks out of place. But I mean, and that there were people living across the Sahara. I mean, that was one of the coolest things I've learned was that the Sahara switches back and forth between a savanna, a green savanna, and a desert.
Right.
And it does so because of orbital dynamics. And basically, it's tied into the same things that are causing the ice ages and then the interglacials. And I mean, that to take a place like the Sahara and turn it green, it's larger than the continental United States. It's just amazing. One of the things I didn't bring up, thinking about the Green Sahara, there's artwork along the Nile. This is one of the places I really want to go back and visit. And it's not on anybody's list. And if it's Qatar or something like that, there are these depictions in the rock that were carved, and a portion of one of them was buried in sand. And that allowed them to do luminescence dating on the sand. And it proves that that this artwork, and there's a lot of it, and that one in particular, it demonstrates that it is at least 15,000 years old. Now it's fully exposed to the environment, and it's carved, I believe, in limestone, and it hasn't eroded. In
Huh.
fact, over 15,000 years during the Green Sahara period, the sand grains didn't even get washed away in the precipitation. Because if that had happened, then we couldn't have dated it. And and it's almost completely uneroded, like I was saying. So, and this is further to the south. So when the Sahara switches, it transitions from the south. It advances green, and when it turns back to desert, it starts at the north as a desert and migrates south. So this is, I don't know how many hundreds of miles south of Giza. So this would have received more precipitation and over a longer period of time than the Sphinx. And yet, it's not eroded. And yet, it's dated without question to 15,000 years ago. It again kills this hypothesis that the Sphinx was eroded by precipitation. Because why would this rock that's the Sphinx have eroded if you believe Schacht's vision of the original head? There's 14 meters of erosion at the nape of the neck from his original depiction of the lion and the neck. But let's go with the more conservative number, which everyone throws out, which is about a meter, roughly 3 feet of erosion on the Sphinx body. Well, then how come this rock art is still here? It's fully exposed to the environment. Why is it there? Again, this completely kills the idea that the Sphinx is older. And of course, you never hear of it because all that they do is present evidence that supports them. They never look at any evidence that doesn't support them. They're not going to do that. And if somebody like me does it, well, the answer is you just ignore them. Their evidence is not relevant, even though it kills their idea.
Right.
Anyway, so yeah, so the Green Sahara, I mean, to me, that was just fascinating. I personally, again, this is where I find myself sort of agreeing with Hancock, and I think a lot of archaeologists too would say this. I'm thinking that switching back and forth of the climate was part of what drove our evolution to create a creature that can live in this ever-changing environment. That at one point they're living in a desert, and then the next point they're living in a green savanna, and then back to a desert. And it also when they the last time they did that, and they congregated in the Nile Valley because it's that little ribbon of green. They brought together people with ideas from all over. And I mean, and that's one of the questions that the alternative archaeologists ask is because, it's kind of like it's already there. There's a civilization. I mean, they have writing and things from the very start. So where were they? Well, prior to learning about a green Sahara, that question was unanswerable. Now we know of the green Sahara. Now we know where they were.
Well, actually, they didn't have writing from the beginning. Writing was something that was actually discovered first in Mesopotamia, and we actually have evidence the Egyptians thought about copying cuneiform writing, but then decided to go with their own pictographic system.
So when did that evolve?
So the earliest writing in Mesopotamia is around 3500 BCE. So, approximately 5500 years. And Egypt caught up within, I think, 300 years, something like that. So they
Okay,
had
because that's
writing within, a pretty short period of time.
yeah. See, again, I don't know the details on the foundation of the Egyptian civilization, but I date it somewhere around there is when they got started. But that's again, I'm not an archaeologist.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about Egypt is, with the compression in that Nile Valley, um, they had a unified culture from a very early date because, I mean, if you're building an empire and you want to resist the Egyptian authorities, where the hell do you go? What terrain can you defend to hold out and maintain independence?
Well, I've also heard it said that it's one of the reasons the Egyptian civilization was lasted so long is because you couldn't have wars with people because they couldn't get across the desert to come in. I mean, they did to the north and south, but yeah, but I mean, it's one of the reasons that it's thought that it's more stable. I mean, also the pyramids themselves were pretty much a make work project, which kept people busy.
Right.
So they also didn't have time. But again, I'm kind of like on the fringes of that. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm
Right.
not really all that interested in archaeology. I'm not dismissing archaeology.
Oh,
I'm
sure.
just saying I'm a geologist. That's what I do. And if we're talking about like the erosion on that artwork, well now I can talk about that. But if you're going to get into the the ancient Egyptian history, I'm not that good on that. Not really
Right.
going to study it. I'm gonna go elsewhere.
Can
I'm gonna
you
look at other things on.
what was the you said the earliest art form was found at can you name that area again?
Yeah. So
On
what was it? I should know this. It's Ging. No, I'm thinking of the wrong person. The guy who studied it was a Dutch guy, and he passed away. Where am I? I'm trying to figure out where I would have that. I can see it in my head. Um, it's. Give me a second here. I'm trying to think as I'm gonna. Okay, where was that? Yeah, it's one of those amazing things when you learn it. You're like, how come I never hear about this? Um, I know it's all right. I think I know where to find it pretty quick. Um, let me just. It's in. I have a Word document where I've like kind of written a book about the Sphinx, and I one of these years, like, and I was working on it. Um, okay, so I'm doing a search in that document for that rock art. 61 hits. It's a really long document.
oh wow.
And I'm almost there. Because we were going to Saharan rock art. What's interesting about the rock art is they compare it to the caves in France. And it's not, damn it, what happened? And what just, I was doing a search and it's, okay. It is okay. It's at Q. I thought so. It's QURTA is the location, and it's 500 miles south of Cairo, 800 kilometers, and is by far the oldest
Wow.
rock art in all of northern Africa. And as I write here, it shows very little erosion, if any. And the archaeologists they definitely dated it based on luminescence dating to 15,000 years ago, but based on the depictions of the art and that it looks like it's been eroded a little bit, or whatever in the sun, whatever reason, they're dating it to it could be as old as 21,000 years old.
Oh wow, because
And I
that
used to,
okay, that's super fascinating because do you know when cattle were domesticated? Because I think it's pretty clear this is depicting cattle, but you know what the date is right now for people thinking when cattle were domesticated.
I don't think they were domesticated back then.
Right. So cattle were first domesticated around 10,500 years ago, based on most studies, and I think
Yeah.
genetically they've also shown that a lot of the earliest herds to be domesticated, are the ancestors of almost every modern
I
herd.
think it's in
Uh,
aurochs, isn't it? Isn't that how you pronounce it?
yeah,
But
and
it's
aurochs. So that is fascinating because maybe they were. I wonder how that could. Huh.
I know.
Well,
I'm like,
that's
this is this huge piece of information that
yeah. This
nobody
is
talks about.
well. This is
And I'm like,
potentially
like,
massive.
yeah, this is so like I say, there's places that when I go to Egypt, like when I went there, okay, the Sphinx was cool, but I was more impressed to be at the Nilometer. Are you familiar with that?
The Nilometer.
Oh,
I
this is
know I've
this
heard of it before, but I'm trying to remember what
it's
it
the
is.
beginning of science. So the ancient Egyptians, this one that's there now is built, I don't know, like 1500 years ago. But the Palermo stone and elsewhere, I believe it's a Palermo stone. There's no question that the ancient Egyptians would measure the level of the Nile every day, year after year, and then they would use and they'd graph it. Think of an Excel graph, and they would plot the level of the Nile on any given day and use that to project how high it's going to get in any given year. So they were projecting based on past performance of the Nile what it's going to be. And I'm
Oh,
like, that's science.
yeah,
That
that
is the
is.
beginning of science. I'm like, this is saying the world is knowable. To me, that was when I went there, I was like, this is the coolest place I have ever been. This is the start. And again, why doesn't anybody talk about it?
Well,
Why is the Nilometer not on every when I
well, because
went
this was
there?
in the Islamic period, so I mean, a lot of people, especially in
No,
the
no, no.
West,
It
want to.
it goes all the way back. It goes back 4,500 years. The ancient Egyptians were doing it. They were using it. I'm thinking that this is just my take on it that the pharaohs were getting this information and then they'd come out and tell people, you know, based on the projection that say it's going to be an ideal because it was too high, it was destruction, and if it was too low, it was famine, and they had that's what they called it, and they would make these projections. So I can just imagine the pharaoh coming out and saying, "You people have been very good this year, so I'm going to give you a wonderful Nile flood," or he's going to come out and say, "You people have been trouble all year and doing the wrong things and you haven't worshiped enough, so I'm going to give you a famine." And and who but a king, who but a god could control the Nile? Now
Well, I
it's
mean,
not going to be 100%.
yeah, because normally though, if the water level was too high or too low, that was a sign that the gods were displeased with the pharaoh.
Yeah, but they would. But he could also. I mean, this is just again, this is my take on it. But I think they could use that. They because they'd know they'd have a very good idea before the peak ever occurred that the Nile was going to flood too high or too low in any given year. I mean, it wasn't
Yeah.
100%, but it was pretty accurate. And what else I was going to say? I was going to go someplace else with that. I mean, it's just fascinating that they were doing this. And when I went, everywhere you go in Egypt, you need a driver. I mean, there's no way you could drive there. I mean, it's just crazy. So we had a driver, and he's like taking us, and we went to that same day. We went to the Egyptian Museum, which was very, very cool. I really recommend it. Now there's a new one that's finally opened. Again, I'm sure it's wonderful. But so on our way back, we stopped on Rhoda on the island, and we went to see the Nilometer. And there is nobody else there. There isn't a parking lot. There's kind of a brick parking lot, but it's very small. Nobody else was there. There was one guy, you got to tip him to go in, and you're in there, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm here. To me,
Right.
that was more special than to see the Sphinx. That was more special than to see the pyramids. That's my take on it. And that I have a picture of myself there. It's just like so cool.
No, that is a
Um,
pretty neat instrument for sure. I mean, that's. And I guess did they find a point in the Nile that would be determinative for the rest of the river, like somewhere that's fairly uh, down south, where you can get a good sense of what you're gonna have upriver? Or I mean,
So as I understand it, there were multiple Nilometers, that there weren't just this one. and there wasn't just this one. They were all over the place, and that some of them, the one were just steps on the shore, and this one, the way it was constructed, is connected at depth to the Nile, so that it doesn't have waves in it. So if it was a windy day, if there were waves, you'd get a very accurate measurement. And oh, I know what I was going to tell you. The other thing about the Nilometer, there's a couple of really cool facts that come from it. One is that we know for certain that prior to the Aswan Dam, at times the Sphinx would have been inundated by the Nile because
Huh.
it's basically side gradient to the Nile, the Nilometer that's there now. And the elevation, the highest elevation, and I did my own research on this, and I wrote my own code to convert the measurements and then compare those with other people's measurements, and I basically agree, but I found some errors in what others had done in the past. But we know for a fact that at one point the highest level, like 1879, something like that, at the Nilometer was 21.4 meters above sea level. That means, without question, that the Sphinx is an island in the Nile surrounded by 1.4 meters of water. There's
Wow.
no question of that. And that prior to the Aswan Dam, the water would lap up and recharge the groundwater beneath. And that's part of why you're getting the erosion from the wicking water. That water is coming from the Nile. But of course that wasn't turned on. This is one of my papers. That wasn't turned on until the Sphinx enclosure, the quarry, was created, and they intersected the capillary rise zone, and that was turned off whenever the Sphinx enclosure filled with sand, which was most of the time. It's only today, it's only recently that the Sphinx enclosure has been cleared of sand, that wicking groundwater eroding the Sphinx has been turned back on. And and the water level beneath the Sphinx has actually risen. And there's a groundwater model of this, and they put in a dewatering system. If you go online, you'll see Mark Lehner is there as they're drilling, and he's got the cores. And I asked him if I could study those cores, and he goes, "They're gone. The things in Egypt, they just disappear. Those are gone." He said, "You ever see Raiders of the Lost Ark, where at the end where it's this giant warehouse?" He said it's like
Right.
that. That's where they're. You're not going to find those.
Oh
And I was
man.
like, but you can tell based on his description, and you can see visually that this is a very weathered limestone that's beneath the Sphinx. And he went out of his way to drill it, one of the holes exactly where they're saying the Hall of Records is, but now they're saying, damn it, you missed it by just a couple of meters, like a meter or so. Damn it. But you can just see that it's just this weathered limestone that it would act very much like a soil more than it would a massive rock. And yeah, so the question is, why is the water table beneath the Sphinx come up, and why do they have to put in a dewatering system? And various things have been proposed. There's a canal near there, but they dismissed the canal that's close to the Sphinx because it was there long before the water levels came up. They were looking at infrastructure. They were saying it was sewers, but if it were sewers, you'd have nitrates from the sewers, and it's not. It's clean water. There's no nitrates in it. Then they're saying, well, it's the municipal water supply system that's leaking, and it would be at the extreme high end of what's possible, of what could come from a leaking infrastructure, but probably not. But again, they're saying, Mark's like, well, this is Egypt. Don't expect things are done well. Um, but I've come to the conclusion that the reason the water has come up is because the area is now paved. So the Sphinx is staring at a KFC Pizza Hut. Do you know that?
I didn't know that exactly. I mean, I knew
Oh
Cairo's
yeah.
right across the river, but I didn't know that
Uh,
that was the building that you would see. So I guess if you get hungry at the Sphinx, you're probably thinking
yeah.
KFC, Taco Bell. Just
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know about a taco. I didn't see a Taco Bell,
or
but the Pizza Hut is there,
yeah.
and there's actually people that you can take pictures from inside, and you can see Pizza Hut backwards as you can see the Sphinx in the distance. So all of this used to be farmland, and when it was farmland, the canal is actually the source of the water. But when all of this was farmland, the water would evaporate, and by paving it and making it streets and houses and I was going to say Taco Bells, but KFCs and Pizza Huts. there's a bookstore right there too. I mean, this that's trapped the water underneath and it can no longer evaporate. And so the canal is the source. I've come to this conclusion and I've done modeling and if you look, so there's places where people measure the evaporation from the water, and these are called pan evaporation rates. And the pan evaporation rate in Cairo is 1.5 meters per year. And based upon my modeling, by paving, well, before they paved it, about 1.25 meters of groundwater would evaporate every year, and that's what's eroding the Sphinx in terms of the wicking groundwater. It's 1.5 meters. That's a lot, and so that's the process. It was just that they paved it and that cut it off. And so it turns out that I don't know if you're familiar with the idea that, or the evidence that the Mediterranean disappeared.
Yes, I have heard about that.
So that was like 6 million years ago. It was pinched off at Gibraltar, and all of the rivers that feed the Mediterranean can't keep up with the evaporation. Again, it's 1.5 meters every year, and so all the rivers like the Nile cut huge canyons. So the city of Cairo is sitting on a Grand Canyon 25% deeper and 5 times longer than the Grand Canyon in Arizona.
Huh.
And it's there. I mean, there's no question. And so when they nobody knew much about this, but so when they were building the Aswan Dam, they picked a location and they're like, you typically look for solid rock on either side, like the Glen Canyon Dam and the Hoover Dam, that sort of thing. And then at the bottom, you just assume you're going to hit bottom because it's a river. Well, and it can't cut deeper than the ocean. And so, it's pretty clear where that would be. And so they anticipated it would be fine. But when they actually went to build it, they couldn't find the bottom. And so they had to build this earthen dam. I mean, so that if you look at the Aswan Dam, it doesn't look like the Hoover Dam or the Glen Canyon Dam. It's not that typical arch. It's just it's spread out over a very large area, and they had to drill and put all this concrete foundations in to stabilize the ground beneath. And it was then that they started looking, and they were like, the only way this could happen is you either have to take Africa and move it 3 miles up, or you have to take away the ocean. And neither one sounds like it's a viable option. And it turns out it was the removal of the Mediterranean, and so they cut this huge canyon there, and that has relevance to the Sphinx and because the Sphinx is sitting at the very edge of that, and Schock has mapped that geophysically, and talks about how at lower elevations, because the Sphinx would have been, if you were to clear it out, the Sphinx would be right on the edge of a giant canyon, very much like the Grand Canyon, because it's a roughly 10 miles across, somewhere in that range, and like I say, even deeper. So the Sphinx would be sitting right on the edge of that.
Right. Huh. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Those are the kind of things, like I'm saying, the things that I've learned. I mean, looking back, maybe I heard something about the Mediterranean disappearing, but now I can tell you more about that. And then the islands. So all of the Mediterranean islands, most of the animals, were wiped out by the flood, and it took it. And it took it like, was it in less than or about 2 years, the Mediterranean was refilled. And so you can imagine that's just would be insane to watch the water level coming up as the Atlantic refills, and talking about a massive flood. And so some of the animals then were trapped on the islands, and exactly how these animals got on the islands isn't exactly known, but there were dwarf mammoths. It's kind of an oxymoron, but and then there were so on Crete, and then there were giant flightless geese that were taller than the mammoths on
Wow.
these islands, and the diversity of these of life with giant tortoises, just like the Galapagos. Um, it was almost not all, but a lot of the islands in the Mediterranean were like that. and that diversity was killed off as humans slowly, about 12,000 years ago or so, made it to these islands and just killed off everything. But yeah, I mean, so there's and how did they get there? And there's a whole, I could go off on tangents of stories and how they discovered that, and how people are scratching their heads, and now they're still like trying to figure out, did the elephants that were there, did they actually evolve from 5.3 million years ago when the Mediterranean refilled? Did they swim there? Because elephants do swim, but the distances seem to be too immense for them to, but nonetheless they were there. I mean, so there's some really interesting questions, and that also falls into this whole thing about how the megafauna extinction is tied in more with humans than it is with the climate. And this is another place where things aren't tied to the Younger Dryas, and a classic place would be in Australia. So prior to luminescence dating with carbon 14 dating, you can only go back about 40,000 years or so. And it's because there's a second source of the residue. I mean, the daughter product, and I don't remember the details on that, but it's like about 40,000 years is about as far back as you can go. But there's some really interesting stuff that seemed like it was going on about 60, 50, 60,000 years ago. And so now we know that the megafauna extinction in Australia, it dates back to about 50,000 years ago. It has nothing to do with the Younger Dryas. And when humans got there, one of the animals they encountered is megalania. And Tim Flannery, an Australian geologist, describes it as a respectably sized Allosaurus. It was like 26 feet long. It was venomous. It could run uphill faster than you could run downhill. He describes it as an echo back to the age of the dinosaurs, and without question, it was the largest reptile that has existed since the dinosaurs.
Wow.
And I'm not sure you want to classify them as reptiles, but it is, and this was there. There is no question that humans encountered megalania. And I mean, it's look it up. It's
Right.
just insane. And and so yeah, I mean, but it so the and what happened then is that the the native so the natives that the Aborigines, when they got there, they started burning the land. And so prior to like 50, 60,000 years ago, somewhere in that range, it was Australia was far more lush and green than it is. And it didn't have all these fire tolerant plants. They were there, but they weren't as prevalent as they had and as they are now. And they changed the entire environment of the entire continent and turned it into a desert. Humans did that with fire. You didn't hunt them to death. That'd be, and some of these larger animals, it would be, they reproduce slower. And I'm guessing, if humans encountered megalania, if I came upon the nest, or if I saw it laying a nest, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to destroy those eggs. They probably make a good breakfast.
Right. A
At
lifetime
the same
supply of
time,
omelets.
yeah. So why would you? I know what I would do, so I'm assuming they would do the same thing. And yeah, so and there was just a recent program on public television. I forgot what it's called, and they were looking at the La Brea tar pits, and they were looking at the extinction there and when it occurred, and it occurred over about a 400-year period. And again, there was a transition in the LA basin from more greenery and to and plants to these fire tolerant plants. And the person interviewing said, "Well, I wish I could remember the name." He goes, "Well, couldn't it be lightning strikes?" And the woman at the La Brea Tar Pit says 97% of the fires in the LA basin are started by humans. And so no. So we have, and this is tied in with the megafauna extinction in the LA basin, which is roughly timed in with the megafauna extinction elsewhere. But also at the same time, we're now analyzing DNA in soil, and we can reconstruct entire ecosystems with the microorganisms to the megafauna from a thimble full of soil. And it turns out that like the woolly mammoths and stuff, the megafauna existed long after the Younger Dryas, long after we, because we're dating it based on the last time we find these fossils. We no longer depended upon just finding those fossils, and it's opened up a whole new door. And of course, this isn't being brought up by Hancock and these people because it proves them wrong. It
Right.
shows that and so they're going to quickly admit that they were on Wrangel Island, so they were definitely without question. Was it mammoths? I believe it's mammoths who were around on Wrangel Island. Um, I'm just trying to remember mastodons or mammoths as the pyramids are being built. In fact, they survived until roughly 4,000 years ago. But now the DNA evidence is saying not just on Wrangel Island, but on the mainland, there were mammoths until roughly something like 4,000 years ago. I don't remember. I remember reading this. I don't remember the exact dates. And again, we don't have we don't have all that detail yet, but they certainly survived the Younger Dryas. There
Right.
is again no tie-in to that, which is again what they're hanging their whole story on. It's just not
Yeah.
there.
Well, I guess that also ties in with you mentioned earlier the advent of agriculture and sort of how that happened at the end of the last ice age. A lot of that, I mean, one of the prevailing theories I've heard to link that all back is that after the last ice age was starting to end, megafauna were hyper abundant, and so part of the reason why agriculture was delayed a little bit is because it was just easy to
Of
find and
course.
trap animals. Like if you just put your village near a river crossing or a stream crossing, animals will go there to drink, and you just walk out of your house and spear down an animal, and now you got a meal, and then you can gather some vegetation pretty easily. And I mean, at
Yeah.
first it was easy, and then as population grows and you start overhunting, then that's where you have to generate more food. And so the idea that a lot of people have had is that's where we start to have agriculture, possibly discovered as a mistake at first or an accident, and then done more deliberately over time.
Yeah, I mean, so do you know who Michael Shermer is? Skeptic magazine.
I have heard of Michael Shermer. Yeah, I think I've
So
seen an interview
I'm
or
not
two with him.
I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe but because of my research on the Sphinx, he asked me to write an article on Göbekli Tepe, and I said sure. And now I'm like, what the hell? I'm no archaeologist. I said yes, and I'm like, so I had to give myself a crash course in advanced archaeology to very much focused on Göbekli Tepe and understanding it. And so I came upon something which I haven't seen reported elsewhere, and that was that when they were first looking, they were doing reconnaissance, and it was uh, people from the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul in like 1963, I believe it was, and they had a botanist along, Jack Harlan, and his responsibility was to determine whether or not the seeds were of domesticated plants or not.
Ah,
And so this was his second trip to Turkey. On a previous trip to Turkey, he had collected some wild variety of wheat and brought it back, and people were like scolding him, like, "What are you gonna do with that? I mean, it's not productive. Look at this; it's useless." And but he just nonetheless he kept the seeds, and it turns out that there was a blight or whatever you call it with the wheat called rust, and his variety of wheat was immune to that. And so they crossbred this variety that he brought back from Turkey and created a variety of wheat, and I don't know, and it stopped people from starving to death from a lack of wheat because because crops were being reduced by this uh, by this blight, whatever, and so he so this is his second trip, and he's there, and while he's there, I don't know if he was bored because they weren't bringing him stuff, but one day he decides he looks out around Göbekli Tepe in that part of Turkey, and he sees all this wild grain. So he went out and with his hands, he collected wild grain, and he just, took it in like a fist and pulled and then put what he collected into a sack. And he said, "I've got the soft hands of a professor, so I can't do this very well. If this were something I'd be doing more often, I'd have calloused hands, and I could work much faster and be far more efficient." And he came back that evening and he told archaeologists that are all, doing reconnaissance. And he said what he did, and they said, well, that's interesting. So they actually gave him some sickle blades that were actual blades that they found, and he put it on. I don't. It wasn't like a stick. It was something artificial, but he used the actual blades, and he went out for an hour the next day and again collected wheat and put it into a sack, and he brought it back to the University of Chicago, and he concluded that a family of 4 working for 3 weeks could collect more wild grain than they could possibly eat in a year. And now we have explained Göbekli Tepe.
Right.
They didn't have to farm. They're affluent foragers, and there's a few places where you see that. Another place was the Native Americans with the salmon runs, on the Columbia River and elsewhere. And so it's now done. And so it was this land of resources. And then you add to that, you're going to have these herds coming through seasonally to eat the wild grain. And I'm like, okay, done. And I've not seen anybody else describe this. You could, if you look it up, if you go to my webpage, you'll find I've got a link to that article. And Jens Notroff, who actually worked at Göbekli Tepe, was a really big help on writing that article. Um, but what's interesting is I think you kind of get there from reading people like Hancock, and you want to kind of add your own 2 cents to these wild conspiracy theories. And it turns out Jens didn't like anything I was saying. He he deleted all of that, and I was okay with it. But it actually I realized at that point that rather than allowing more speculation, people like Hancock, because the way that they're doing it, they're actually limiting people. They're limiting people from suggesting alternative ideas because they don't want to sound like Hancock. So, I see that. I mean, there's some positives in what he's doing, like I was saying earlier, but at the same time, because there were some things that I was like, I don't even remember what they were, and I was like totally okay with it because I was like, oh, it's kind of silly. But I mean, I did have, some ideas. I mean, so one of my ideas would be like domestication of animals. If you're at Göbekli Tepe, this is me thinking out loud. If you're at Göbekli Tepe and you've got these herd animals coming through, and you're going to have, your big heyday as the herds are coming through, I would personally take some of the younger herd animals if I could and capture them and keep them in a corral. I wouldn't feed them because they didn't have refrigerators. So if you want meat in the middle of winter, where are you going to get it? You need a live animal.
Right.
And so I would think that, and this is just again me thinking out loud. So then which animal is going to go first? Well, the one that's breaking out, the one the one that's not so docile. You're gonna take that animal and say, no, they're gone. That one is just, and so you're gonna take and you're gonna have the most docile, and you're gonna domesticate them. Then let's say you have a really good winter, and you didn't have to kill it, or perhaps one of the kids becomes emotionally attached to the animal, and you can't kill Bambi for supper, maybe, and the dad's like, yeah, maybe, okay, I won't, but I can see how something like that could lead to domestication without them even realizing that they're domesticating.
Right. I'm sure that's probably about how it happened. That and also the process of really doing agriculture in the sense we think of it. I'm sure that it was not planned out in any way, and it just kind of started to happen, and then people caught on as they were going along. I mean, also, if you look at when a lot of species were domesticated, they all kind of happened simultaneously to some extent.
Yeah.
And cats seem to have come along precisely because people wanted to protect their grain stores.
I mean,
Um,
that's exactly it.
yeah.
And I'm like, again, what's being presented by Hancock and these people is that it was a advanced civilization that brought, farming to the people of Göbekli Tepe. So it was intentional, and and we don't, and it doesn't answer the question because, well, okay, so okay, let's go through. There was this lost civilization, but then when did they start farming, and how did that happen? You've just
Right.
pushed it back, and you haven't raised that. And I still remember one time, I remember saw Elon Musk was on Joe Rogan one time, and Rogan brings up, the possibility of a lost civilization, and I really like Elon's response. He goes, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change much. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and humans have been around 300,000 years, and you want to push civilization back 20,000 years? It's insignificant. It really isn't changing anything in the grand scheme of things. And
That's
you can
true.
see Rogan, and Rogan's like, yeah, and Musk is like dismissing the whole thing.
Well, also
And
the part that's always weirded me out about the pseudo archaeology crowd is they say that there's a conspiracy to cover up the truth because the truth is dangerous. I don't see what is threatened by if there was a revelation that civilization dates back to whatever date. I really don't see how that threatens anyone in power.
I think even more importantly, what they talk about is how we're all, as scientists, we don't want to rock the boat. And I'm sorry, as a scientist, everything I'm trying to do is to rock the boat. Every scientist is trying to prove Einstein wrong. Every scientist is trying to prove Darwin wrong. The people that do these things. Science is all about proving other people wrong, and keep pushing it. So the idea that scientists do not, don't want to rock the boat. I mean, if you come up with crazy ideas, I'm going to go, yeah, that's not possible. But if you come up with something that's plausible, I mean, that's why Einstein is famous. That's why Darwin is famous, is because they did rock the boat.
All right.
They
I
did
mean, they
come up with something
demolished
entire.
previous paradigms.
Yeah. So I mean, the argument doesn't even make any sense when you look at the history of science and how scientists respond. I mean, I am somewhat pleased that I am able to say, I've had people like, are you really saying that everyone else is wrong? And I'm saying, yes. I'm saying that every archaeologist, every geologist who has ever studied the Sphinx is wrong about the erosion. That includes mainstream archaeologists and alternative archaeologists. I am saying that. I'm proud to say that. I am rocking the boat. I'm
Yeah.
doing.
No. That's uh
I-
that's a yeah, that's a great point. Also, I guess this kind of dovetails back to you mentioned before the show that you reside in Wisconsin and also obviously you do geology. So I was wondering if you're familiar with the Kettle Moraine Park, and if
oh
so,
yeah.
um, it kind of reminds me of what you were talking about with the Sphinx and how the head is more durable than the body. Because I visited this park this past summer, and I saw these unique formations, which you kind of have these rounded. I'm trying to pull up a picture right now, but these rounded hubs.
Oh yeah,
What are they
yeah. So
called?
is this the site with the round? There's a friend of mine, a geologist. Where are you located in Ohio? Are you
Uh,
in
I,
Columbus?
I'm in the Columbus area. Yeah.
I've been down there many times, so I do training with a geologist down that way, and he's retired now, semi-retired, and he's been working on that site. And what he described is this circular thing. I forgot what it's called, but it's a circular thing, and it's kind of dug into the ground.
Yes. Yeah. Those. I think there are multiple. I think they call them bells or kettlebells. I forget exactly what they call these formations, but
Yeah, so we have, I mean, probably where my condo is right now is almost certainly an effigy mound because I'm up on a hill right next to a lake. And I mean, this would have been the idea. And there's a spot just a few miles from me. The whole area is just nothing but effigy mounds. And I mean, it's interesting. That was an extension, basically. And again, I'm not an archaeologist from the south, and that was during a warm period. But exactly at the same time as people were building, constructing these effigy mounds here in Wisconsin and elsewhere, they were building cathedrals in Europe. So,
right.
as impressive as these things are, and they are, you got to be looking, to present them as Hancock is doing, with his snake one. I forgot what it's called,
Uh,
and say it's a line to the, it's like the
right.
setting sun and whatever. I'm like, come on.
Yeah, that's in southern Ohio, I think right along the border of Kentucky. I know what you're talking about, but yeah, that was yeah, he tried to claim that that was dug out during the very early part of the period right after the Ice Age or during the Ice Age. But of course, the
Yeah,
problem
but we
with that
know
is
in
that the ice sheet was about where I'm at, and so the area would be way too permafrosted to dig something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, so and the thing is that they are dated, and we know when they were constructed. I mean, there's artifacts that are buried in them. I'm not that familiar. There's a professor who retired here, Bob. I can't think of his last name right now. Yeah, I mean, they're without question they're fascinating. What's really interesting is do you ever hear of an intaglio?
Taglio,
Intaglio.
intaglio. It sounds very familiar, but I'm not
So
100%
it's the
sure.
opposite of an effigy mound. It's dug. It's a shape of an animal dug into the ground.
Ah,
And there's only one remaining intaglio in the world. There were
oh,
only 10 ever discovered, all in Wisconsin. And there's only one, and it's near Fort Atkinson. And I've been there. And it's a panther,
oh
and
wow,
it's right next to a river. And when you get a heavy rain, it fills, and you get the outline of a panther. And I mean, it's in this residential neighborhood. The long tail goes under the driveway of the house. So it's like
wow,
this empty lot where you'd expect a house, and there's no house. There is instead this intaglio.
that's
And
amazing.
what's real it is, and so there were like only 10 in the world. There were four of them on my dead end street that I grew up on. When you look up, I was like, "You're kidding me!" But that had long since been quarried, and the gravel was used to make concrete to build Milwaukee, and then they backfilled it with trash. But I mean, it was right there. It was
Huh.
right at the intersection of because I was like, I talked to somebody and else showed me this, and so I went online and I found the hand drawn map and I superimposed it. I could tell where that was based on where the Milwaukee River is, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, there's no question, and that there was a Thunderbird right where our house was. And here's the thing: there was an artist from Japan who came here in 1968, Sachio Yamashita, and he came to cover the 1968 Democratic Convention. And he was also a foodie, and he was very much into beer. And when he went to Chicago, he wanted to understand the United States. He said he had to learn where their beer came from. And they told him that it was Milwaukee, and somehow he translated Milwaukee into the Milky Way. So he thought he's driving up to the coolest city on the planet that's called Milky Way that makes beer. But anyway, so he started making all of this artwork, and he was enamored by, very much inspired and enamored by I'm not sure that's the right word, the effigy mounds. And so one time he was painting on the parking structure of the Mark Plaza in downtown Milwaukee, this hotel, a giant Thunderbird. And by chance, I helped him. I was
Oh wow.
getting paid $100 a day to help paint a Thunderbird on the side, where we've got this big, cherry picker, this snorkel device to get us up. And I was basically operating it as other people were painting. They were more artists than I am. Not that it really required that, but nonetheless, they were better than me. And so I did that for a week. And then as we got to the far end of the building, he didn't, he planned out the snorkel device, but we had dropped a full story because it was on a hill and we could no longer reach and to paint the head. And we tried painting from on top. It was like doing a somersault 5 stories up off of the side of a building and with a long extension on a roller and trying to paint some details. I'm like, while somebody's holding onto your legs, and you're like, oh my God. And then we tried reaching up from the snorkel device, and we couldn't get up high enough, and we didn't know what to do. And I finally took the artwork from him. I still remember doing this because he couldn't do it as the artist. and I took his giant bird and I drew a head that I thought we could paint. And so here I am. I made a giant thunderbird with a disproportionately small head that's roughly the size of the Sphinx. I'm like, I did that. I did exactly. Helped on something that's this massive piece of art that ends up with a small head. And
Right.
every time I drove by, I, I'd see it from the highway and I'd laugh. Like it kind of looked more like a parakeet now than it did a thunderbird because the way, and even that head almost turned out to be impossible. And so Mark Lehner, I don't know if you know this, so Mark Lehner is proposing that they didn't find what's called the major fissure until they were excavating and carving the Sphinx, and that's why they elongated it, and that's why the head is disproportionately small. And maybe there was some worker, not the artist himself, who's like, here's what we could do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's possible. That could have happened. I mean, maybe the chief architect was off that day, and the apprentice made the call.
So yeah, I mean, because I did that. It's just, I'm like, wow. It's gone. It's long gone, and I don't have any pictures of it. And I should contact the hotel. I bet that they do. It's not been on my to-do list. And I could, tell him that I was one of the people that helped paint that. And Saccio, he was listed as one of the one year he was I think it was that year he was listed as one of the 50 most influential people of the year in People magazine. And I was like, I know this guy. He's
Wow.
That's Saccio.
Yeah.
He's a really good chef. Anyways, I think I should be getting going here. Is there anything that you want to talk about that we haven't?
I think we covered quite a few things. That's really interesting. I guess the only other thing I would point out with the intaglio that you pointed out in Wisconsin is this reminds me a little bit of the Nazca lines. The famous, I guess it'd be Inca or at least Peruvian um, things where you can't really see them from the ground, but if you look from the sky, you can see the outlines of animals. Um, so
I've never made that analogy. I'm 100% with you. I'm thinking it's basically the same thing. And again, it can only be viewed from above, whatever that implies. I'm thinking they're doing it for their
yeah,
deities. But yeah, that is I've never heard that. I really think that makes sense. It's sort of like the ancient rock art in Africa where they're speculating that it looks very much like the cave art in France.
right.
And that's not my call, that's their call. But yeah,
Yeah,
that's
no,
intriguing. I
uh,
mean,
you definitely see that people around the world, one thing they enjoy is drawing animals.
yeah, and I mean, so why would you do that? I mean, are you trying to anticipate your hunt? Are you revering these animals? I mean, what's the reason?
Yeah, it's hard to say.
That's
I have no
interesting.
idea. But it is a fascinating thing. And I mean, I guess a whole lot of what was in North America once in terms of these kind of monuments, I mean, a lot of it's been destroyed. I mean, I know here in Ohio, they had all kinds of mounds that were made artificially, and a lot of the early white settlers dismantled those for raw building materials. I mean, the Ohio State House is built out of a lot of the mounds that were once in the Columbus area, and a
Yeah.
number of towns are that way. And actually, they would locate these towns a lot of times early on for settlement based on mounds. It was only after they had dismantled most of them that they figured out, wait, these aren't naturally occurring. And
Yeah. I mean, they didn't care at all. They just plowed it over for farmland in cities and yeah.
yeah,
And I mean, to imagine what there was. I mean,
right.
yeah, it's sad. I mean, but I mean, it's gone. I mean, yeah,
Yeah,
they didn't care.
it's very unfortunate because I'm I guess also with a lot of the cities we know were here up until the Middle Ages in North America. I mean, like Cahokia. I imagine it
We've
couldn't have
got
been the
one
only
right here.
one.
We've got one right here, Astalon, and it's definitely a city. And it's on the Rock River. It's between Milwaukee and Madison, a little closer to Madison. And yeah, they reconstructed part of it, it's got the, like, I don't know if you want to call it a pyramid, but there's a big mound, and yeah, and it's surrounded by these, poles, and yeah, I mean, it was protective, and from what I don't know, but and they cleared, and they had agriculture, and they were floating trees from way upriver
Oh
because
wow.
they had already clear cut the area, and so they're floating trees down the river. And when I went there one time, I could see what looked like stepping stones. The river was very low, and I was like, "There's got to be something on the other side here. These stepping stones go somewhere. It's not much of a river. I mean, it's a decent river, but it's not massive." And there were some kids there. There's a museum right there. They're like these homeschool kids. This is like 20 years ago, and they said, "Yeah, that there's all these artifacts on the other side of the river, and it's all overgrown. I mean, it's all woods
Huh.
now." But I was like, "Man, there." And then there's even a bigger hill, which is farmland, which is further to the west. And I look at that, and I've never talked to anybody who's familiar with it, but it would seem to me that that would have been part of this whole thing, that it's right there. It would have been, as far as I know, outside the bounds of what was enclosed, but it's very similar to the smaller one that they reconstructed. But I'm thinking, yeah, that was there, and it's farmland, and every year they plow it, and so it becomes a little less pronounced than it was the year before. But every time I stop and look at it, I'm like, that's gotta be part of this, and it's quite massive if that's the
Wow.
case. But again, I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know about Aztalan. Well,
Yeah, so Ken Feder, if you know, or Feder, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He wrote a book called "The 50 Archaeological Must-See Sites in America," something on that order is the title, and he puts Astalon in it.
huh. Okay.
And I was like, wow, that's
That's pretty
cool,
cool.
right here.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I'll have to check out sometime. I still need to go see the Serpent Mound. I haven't gotten down there yet, um, but yeah, no. Thank you, Bob, for showing up today and sharing all this with us. I certainly think that your theory about the Sphinx has a lot of merit, and I look forward to seeing where all that goes in terms of how archaeologists and geologists will respond, and we'll see if
Yeah.
maybe if you become sufficiently famous, Randall Carlson will have to debate you just to try to retain relevance.
Yeah, or just let me get out there and speak. I am working on a paper, so I'm going to publish that as a paper at some point, and so that's coming. I've got a few other things I'm working on my software right now, but within a couple of months, it's basically done. I just got to put the final touches on it. So instead of just having this discussion, we'd have a more detailed paper, and it's quite comprehensive. I'm not just focused in on the Osiris shaft. And yeah, but also I want to say, yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on. And anybody who's listening, there, if you go to the Joe Rogan podcast, the web page that he has, there's a form that you can fill out and suggest a guest. If you find this interesting, and if you want to, let other people learn about it, if you could get on that and just, say, yeah, why don't you have Bob on as a guest? We could all learn something from that. I could learn where I'm wrong if I'm wrong, and they could learn where they might be wrong, and we could also maybe agree. Who knows? And so, yeah, if anybody's out there, put my name in. I'm willing to appear there anytime. I'm not afraid of appearing on that program and explaining what's going on with in terms of the Sphinx and other things. So again, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. And with that, I suppose we'll call it a day. So thank you everyone who showed up to hear this talk. And next week, I'm sure we'll also be back with another episode. But yes, thank you, Bob, and everybody have a good evening. For the first time, we're ending in an afternoon, so that's kind of exciting. So, all right, I'll quit rambling now. So, goodbye, everybody. All right.